In the beginning there was the Word, but before the Word there was the silence that dreamed of speaking. In that primordial quiet, before consciousness learned to name itself, before the ego built its fortress of certainty, there existed a realm where creation sleeps like a seed in winter's earth, waiting for the soul brave enough to disturb its rest. You are that soul. You have always been that soul, even when the world conspired to convince you otherwise. There exists within the architecture of human consciousness a cathedral that most never enter, its doors hidden behind the practical concerns of daily existence, its spires reaching toward realms that rational minds dismiss as fantasy. Yet you who feel the pull of something larger than yourself, something that moves through you like wind through an empty vessel, you have found yourself standing before those ancient doors, hearing the echo of your own footsteps in chambers vast enough to hold eternity. Carl Jung understood what the modern world has forgotten, that creativity is not a luxury of the privileged or the pastime of the idle, but a fundamental force of existence itself, as essential to the human spirit as breath is to the body. It is the voice of the self, the deeper, truer identity that lies beneath the masks we wear and the roles we play, calling to us from depths we have barely begun to fathom. But to answer that call requires a kind of death, not the death of the body, but something far more terrifying to the ego that believes itself to be the totality of who we are. It requires the death of certainty, the death of the need to be understood by those who have never heard the whisper of the unconscious, the death of the small, safe life that asks nothing of us but conformity and survival. The creative unconscious does not knock politely at the door of consciousness. It arrives like a flood, like a fire, like a storm that reshapes the landscape of everything you thought you knew about yourself. It brings with it visions that have no place in the orderly world of committees and consensus, dreams that speak in languages older than words, impulses that seem to arise from some cosmic source that flows through you but does not belong to you. This is the beautiful curse of the creative soul, to be chosen as a vessel for forces that dwarf individual understanding, to be tasked with bringing into form that which exists only in the realm of pure potential. It is to become a bridge between the world as it is and the world as it might be, to serve as translator for truths that can only be spoken in the symbolic language of art, music, poetry, and imagination. But first, you must recognize the signs. First, you must learn to distinguish between the voice of your authentic creative nature and the cacophony of borrowed dreams, societal expectations, and ego-driven ambitions that masquerade as inspiration. The path of true creativity is not about becoming famous or wealthy or even understood. It is about becoming who you were always meant to be, about allowing the seed of your deepest nature to crack open and reach toward the light. Jung spoke of individuation, the process by which one becomes who one truly is, differentiated from the collective masses, while paradoxically connected to the universal patterns that govern all human experience. For the creative soul, individuation and creation are not separate processes, but two faces of the same sacred work. Every authentic creative act is an act of self-discovery. Every genuine self-discovery is an act of creation. Yet this path is not for the faint of heart. To embrace your creative nature means to accept responsibility for gifts you did not choose, to become accountable to visions that may isolate you from those who prefer the safety of the known and the comfort of the conventional. It means learning to trust in processes that unfold according to their own mysterious timeline, to surrender to forces larger than your individual will, while simultaneously taking complete responsibility for their expression through your unique vessel. The modern world, with its emphasis on productivity and efficiency, on measurable outcomes and predictable results, has little patience for the creative process, with its seasons of dormancy, its periods of apparent waste, its refusal to be hurried or controlled. The creative unconscious operates according to natural law, not human convenience. like the oak tree that grows for decades before it produces its first acorn, like the river that carves the canyon grain by grain over millennia. Creative work requires a patience that our instant gratification culture has forgotten how to cultivate. But you who feel the stirring of something larger than yourself, you who find yourself drawn to create, even when you cannot explain why or for whom, you understand intuitively what the rational mind struggles to accept, that some things cannot be rushed, some truths cannot be forced, some gifts cannot be claimed, but only received with the humility of one who recognizes their role as steward rather than owner. The awakening of the creative unconscious is rarely gentle. It comes like dawn breaking over a landscape that has known only darkness, illuminating features of the inner terrain that were always present, but never seen. Suddenly you notice patterns where others see chaos, beauty where others see emptiness, possibility where others see limitation. The ordinary world begins to reveal its extraordinary nature, and you find yourself possessed by an almost overwhelming desire to capture, to express, to give form to the infinite formlessness that presses against the boundaries of your understanding. This is not the awakening of talent, though talent may be its vehicle. This is not the awakening of ambition, though ambition may be its fuel. This is the awakening of calling, that ancient word that suggests something far more profound than career or hobby, or even passion. A calling implies that you have been called, that some force outside your conscious choosing has selected you for a particular work, that your life has been arranged by invisible hands to prepare you for a task you may not fully understand, but cannot refuse. Jung understood that the unconscious is not merely the repository of forgotten memories or repressed desires, but a living creative intelligence that operates according to its own profound logic. It speaks to us through symbols and synchronicities, through dreams and sudden insights, through the patterns of attraction and repulsion that shape our choices, even when we believe ourselves to be acting rationally. For the creative soul, learning to dialogue with this unconscious intelligence becomes as essential as breathing. The shadow, that aspect of ourselves that we have learned to reject or deny, often contains the very energies that fuel our most authentic creative expression. What we judge in ourselves may be the raw material from which our greatest gifts emerge, the parts of our nature that seem too intense, too strange, too different to be acceptable in polite society, may be precisely the qualities that make our creative voice unique and necessary. But integrating the shadow requires tremendous courage, for it means acknowledging aspects of ourselves that contradict the image we have worked so hard to maintain. It means accepting our darkness as well as our light, our chaos as well as our order, our wildness as well as our civilization. Only when we can embrace the totality of our nature can we create from a place of authentic wholeness rather than carefully curated fragments. The persona, the mask we wear to navigate social reality, serves an important function in daily life, but it can become a prison for the creative soul if we mistake it for our true identity. The roles we play, the expectations we fulfill, the versions of ourselves that win approval and avoid conflict, all of these may be necessary for survival in the world, but none of them is the source from which genuine creativity flows. Authentic creative expression requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into either extreme. It is the capacity to be both disciplined and spontaneous, both individual and universal, both deeply personal and broadly accessible. This paradoxical state cannot be achieved through effort alone, but must be cultivated through practices that train consciousness to remain fluid and responsive rather than rigid and reactive. The individuation process for the creative soul involves learning to distinguish between the voice of the ego, which seeks control, recognition, and security, and the voice of the self, which seeks expression, authenticity, and service to something larger than individual desire. The ego asks, "What will this get me?" The self asks, "What does this work ask of me?" The ego seeks to use creativity for personal advancement. The self allows creativity to use the individual as its instrument. This distinction is crucial because the forces that drive authentic creativity are often at odds with the forces that drive personal ambition. True creative work may lead to recognition and reward, but it may also lead to misunderstanding, rejection, or obscurity. The creative soul must learn to find satisfaction in the quality of their offering rather than the quantity of its reception, to measure success by the depth of their surrender to the creative process rather than the breadth of their external achievements. Yet this does not mean that the creative path is one of passive waiting or mystical withdrawal from practical reality. The marriage of conscious and unconscious, the union of vision and craft, requires tremendous discipline and skill. Dreams must be translated into form. Inspirations must be refined through practice. Visions must be grounded in the concrete materials of their chosen medium. The creative soul becomes both mystic and craftsperson, both visionary and technician, both receiver and shaper of the forces that flow through them. The awakening of the creative unconscious brings with it a profound sense of responsibility, not just to one's own authentic expression, but to the collective healing and evolution that art, music, literature, and all forms of creative work can facilitate. Jung believed that the individual psyche is connected to the collective psyche of humanity, and that the process of individual healing contributes to the healing of the whole. In this sense, every authentic creative act is an act of service, a gift offered to the world, regardless of whether it is recognized or received. But service of this kind requires enormous trust, trust in processes that cannot be controlled, trust in gifts that were not earned, trust in a creative intelligence that operates according to laws more ancient and mysterious than human logic. It requires the willingness to be used by forces larger than oneself, to become a hollow reed through which the wind of inspiration can blow, to empty oneself of personal agenda so completely that something genuinely new can emerge. This emptying is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the creative path, for it asks us to release not only our attachment to specific outcomes, but our attachment to being the one who controls the process. The ego that has spent a lifetime building its sense of identity through achievement and recognition must learn to step aside and allow something else to work through it. This is a kind of death that feels more threatening than physical death, because it challenges our most fundamental assumptions about who we are and what makes us valuable. Yet on the other side of this death, or rather through the midst of it, for it is not a single event but an ongoing surrender, lies the possibility of touching something eternal through our temporal existence, of participating in the ongoing creation of reality through our individual creative expression. We discover that we are not the source of creativity but its vessel, not its master but its servant, not its owner but its temporary guardian. The awakening of the creative unconscious is ultimately an initiation into mystery, the mystery of how something emerges from nothing, how form arises from formlessness, how the infinite expresses itself through the finite. It is an invitation to become a conscious participant in the fundamental creative principle that drives evolution itself, to align our individual will with the cosmic will that seeks expression through countless unique vessels. As you stand at the threshold of this recognition, as you feel within yourself the stirring of forces that refuse to be contained within the narrow confines of conventional life, you are being invited into one of humanity's most ancient and sacred roles, that of the bridge builder between worlds, the translator of mystery into meaning, the midwife of possibility itself. The question is not whether you are worthy of this calling, for the call itself creates the worthiness. The question is whether you have the courage to answer, knowing that the answer will change everything, knowing that once you have tasted the wine of authentic creative expression, nothing else will ever fully satisfy your thirst. The theater of sleep opens its curtains each night, but for you the performance that unfolds upon that darkened stage bears little resemblance to the ordinary dreams that visit most souls, where others experience the mind's nocturnal housekeeping, fragments of the day rearranged. memories sorted and filed, anxieties given temporary form. You witness something far more extraordinary. You dream in hues that have no names, in spectrums that exist beyond the reach of waking vision, in colors so vivid and impossible that your sleeping consciousness struggles to contain their intensity. This is the first sacred sign, the initial whisper from the depths that marks you as one chosen to serve the creative mysteries. Your dreams are not random neural firing, but prophetic canvas, not mere psychological debris, but architectural blueprints for realities waiting to be born. In the sanctuary of sleep, unbound by the limitations of physical law or social convention, your psyche becomes laboratory and artist studio, experimental theater and divine workshop rolled into one. Jung recognized dreams as the royal road to the unconscious, but for the creative soul, they represent something even more profound. They are the preliminary sketches of eternity, the rough drafts of tomorrow's masterpieces, the seeds of innovations that will reshape the world's understanding of what is possible. When you wake with fragments of music that has never been composed echoing in your ears, when you carry into daylight the memory of stories that pulse with their own heartbeat, when you find yourself haunted by visions of inventions that could revolutionize human experience, you are receiving direct transmission from the creative source itself. The colors you dream transcend the visible spectrum, not because your sleeping mind has somehow accessed supernatural wavelengths, but because it has touched the realm where all colors exist as pure potential before they condense into the narrow band of frequencies that ordinary vision can detect. These dream colors are emotional frequencies made visible, spiritual qualities given chromatic form, archetypal energies painted in shades that have no equivalent in the waking world's palette. You have dreamed in the silver green of possibilities not yet born, in the deep amber of ancient wisdom, awakening in modern consciousness, in the electric violet of breakthrough moments crackling with transformative power. You have seen landscapes painted in the coral gold of emerging love, cities built from the crystalline blue of perfect understanding, forests growing in the warm crimson of authentic self-expression. These are not arbitrary psychedelic effects, but the natural language of the unconscious, which speaks in symbol and sensation because it deals with realities too complex for words alone to convey. The dreams of the creative soul often carry the quality of what Jung called big dreams, those profound nocturnal experiences that feel less like personal psychological content and more like messages from the collective unconscious itself. These dreams have a luminous quality, a sense of significance that lingers long after waking, a feeling that something important has been communicated, even when the rational mind struggles to decode the message. They feel less like products of individual imagination and more like visitations from an intelligence that uses your sleeping consciousness as its canvas. In these chromatic visions, you witness the birth of symphonies in colors that shimmer and flow like living water, each hue corresponding to a different musical phrase, each shade representing a distinct emotional movement within the larger compositional structure. The deep purple-black of the opening movement swirls into the golden yellow of the rising melody, which then transforms into the fierce orange-red of the climactic passage before resolving into the soft blue-white of the concluding harmony. You wake knowing that somewhere in the realm of possibility, this music exists complete and perfect, waiting only for your conscious skill to translate its chromatic code into audible form. The stories that visit your dreams come painted in narrative colors, the dusty rose of nostalgia that paints the background of memory-based tales, the electric green of adventure stories crackling with possibility, the deep indigo of mystery tales that probe the shadows of human nature, the warm amber of wisdom stories that carry ancient truths in contemporary form. Each story dream arrives with its own unique chromatic signature, its emotional palette as distinctive as a fingerprint, as recognizable as a familiar voice calling your name across a crowded room. But perhaps most remarkably, you dream of inventions and innovations painted in colors that seem to predict their eventual impact upon the world. The soft silver blue of technologies that will heal, the vibrant orange gold of discoveries that will inspire, the deep forest green of solutions that will restore balance to systems gone awry. These dream inventions appear not as mechanical constructs, but as living entities with their own color consciousness, their own chromatic personality, that somehow encodes their future function and meaning. The challenge facing the creative dreamer lies not in receiving these visions, for they come unbidden, gifts from depths beyond conscious control, but in learning to trust their significance and in developing the skills necessary to translate their impossible colors into forms that the waking world can perceive and understand. This requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to bridge the gap between unconscious content and conscious expression, to serve as translator between the realm of pure possibility and the realm of manifest reality. Most people dismiss their dreams as neural noise, as random firing of synapses during the brain's maintenance cycles, as meaningless fantasy with no connection to waking reality. But you have learned to recognize the difference between ordinary dreams, those psychological housekeeping sessions where the mind sorts through daily experiences, and extraordinary dreams, those sacred visitations where future realities announce themselves in impossible colors and impossible forms. The ordinary dream feels personal, contained, related to recent experiences or ongoing concerns. It may be strange or symbolic, but it remains within the bounds of individual psychology, processing material that belongs to your personal history and immediate circumstances. The extraordinary dream, by contrast, feels transpersonal, infinite, connected to sources of knowledge and creativity that extend far beyond individual experience. It carries the quality of revelation, of discovery, of encounter with intelligence that transcends personal consciousness. Learning to navigate between these different levels of dream experience requires developing what might be called chromatic intuition, the ability to read the emotional and spiritual content encoded in the impossible colors that paint your sleeping visions. Just as a trained musician can hear the emotional content in different musical keys, the creative dreamer learns to interpret the meaning carried by dream colors that have no equivalent in waking experience. The silver green of nascent possibilities feels different from the gold green of possibilities approaching manifestation. The electric blue of intellectual breakthrough carries a different quality than the soft blue of emotional healing. The deep red of passionate creation has a different texture than the bright red of urgent action. Each shade, each hue, each subtle gradation carries its own specific message, its own particular instruction about the nature of the creative work that seeks expression through your unique vessel. But these chromatic codes are not arbitrary assignments that could be memorized like a foreign language vocabulary. They arise from the deep structure of psyche itself, from archetypal patterns that govern both individual consciousness and collective human experience. The colors you dream are personal expressions of universal principles, individual variations on eternal themes that have been painting themselves across human consciousness since the species first learned to dream. This is why your impossible dream colors often correspond to emotional and spiritual realities that others recognize even when they cannot name or directly perceive the chromatic dimension of your experience. When you translate a silver-green dream possibility into a concrete creative project, others respond to the quality of emerging potential even if they never see the color code from which your work arose. When you manifest a golden amber dream wisdom in a piece of writing or artistic creation, readers recognize the presence of ancient knowledge, even if they remain unconscious of the chromatic frequency that guided your creative process. The dreams that visit the creative soul often carry what Jung called a numinous quality, a sense of encounter with something sacred, something that demands reverence and careful attention. These are not dreams to be analyzed and dissected, but dreams to be honored and served, visions to be translated rather than interpreted, gifts to be shared rather than hoarded. They come bearing responsibility as well as inspiration, for they represent future realities that will only manifest if someone proves willing to serve as their midwife, their translator, their bridge between the realm of pure potential and the realm of concrete manifestation. The colors that paint these numinous dreams are themselves sacred technologies, encoding methods of transformation that cannot be communicated through ordinary language, but must be experienced directly, translated into form through creative action, made manifest through the disciplined application of conscious skill to unconscious inspiration. They are invitations to participate in the ongoing creation of reality itself, to serve as conscious collaborators in the process by which possibility becomes actuality. Yet receiving these chromatic revelations is only the beginning of the creative process, not its completion. The dream colors must be translated into the specific materials of your chosen medium, paint and canvas for the visual artist, words and rhythm for the writer, sound and silence for the musician, movement and space for the dancer. This translation process requires not only technical skill, but also what might be called chromatic fidelity, the ability to preserve the essential quality of the dream vision while adapting it to the limitations and possibilities of physical materials. Some translations will be direct. A dream painted in impossible blues might become a piece of music composed in a minor key that evokes the same emotional quality. Others will be metaphorical. A vision of silver-green possibility might become a story about characters standing at the threshold of transformation. Still, others will be symbolic. A landscape painted in dream amber might inspire an invention designed to preserve ancient wisdom in contemporary forms. But in every case, the authentic creative act preserves some essential quality of the original dream vision while making it accessible to consciousness that operates within the normal spectrum of human perception. The impossible becomes possible not by losing its impossibility, but by finding forms that allow its impossibility to be experienced and shared within the constraints of manifest reality. As you learn to trust the significance of your chromatic dreams, as you develop skill in translating their impossible colors into possible forms, you discover that you are participating in something far larger than personal creative expression. You are serving as antenna for frequencies broadcast from the collective unconscious, as receiver for transmissions from the realm where all creative possibilities exist in their pure potential state. Your individual consciousness becomes a tuning device, capable of detecting and translating signals that most minds cannot perceive. This is both tremendous privilege and tremendous responsibility, for the dreams that visit you carry within their impossible colors the seeds of future realities that depend upon creative souls like yourself for their manifestation. They are not merely personal fantasies, but collective prophecies, not individual entertainment, but species-wide guidance, not random neural activity, but systematic instruction in the art of conscious evolution. The question that faces you, as you wake from these chromatic visions, is not whether they are real in some objective sense, but whether you are prepared to serve as their translator, to take responsibility for bringing their impossible colors into forms that others can perceive and experience. For in the end, the reality of dreams is not determined by their correspondence to external facts, but by their capacity to generate new realities through the creative work of those brave enough to trust their significance and skilled enough to translate their revelation into manifest form. While the world around you fills its emptiness with noise, endless chatter, constant connection, perpetual stimulation designed to ward off the terror of being alone with oneself, you discover something that seems almost revolutionary in its simplicity. Solitude feels like coming home, not the grudging acceptance of loneliness that most experience when circumstance forces them into unwanted isolation, but the deep, cellular recognition that arrives when you finally find yourself in your own company without distraction, without agenda, without the need to be anyone other than exactly who you are. This is the second sacred sign, perhaps the most misunderstood marker of the creative soul in a culture that has confused connection with contact, community with crowd, and belonging with the mere proximity of other bodies. Your need for solitude is not antisocial pathology, but sacred requirement, not withdrawal from life, but pilgrimage to its source, not escape from relationship, but journey toward the only relationship that can serve as foundation for all others, the relationship with your own depths. Jung understood what the extroverted world struggles to accept, that creativity requires descent into regions where the crowd cannot follow, where the noise of others' expectations cannot penetrate, where the authentic voice can finally speak without competing with the cacophony of borrowed thoughts and second-hand dreams. In the hermit's cave of your own company, you discover that silence is not empty but pregnant with possibility, not vacant but full to overflowing with potentials that can only emerge in the absence of external demand. The creative process, at its most fundamental level, is an intimate conversation between consciousness and the unconscious, a delicate dialogue that requires the same conditions that allow lovers to share their deepest truths: privacy, patience, and the kind of safety that can only exist when performance is unnecessary. This conversation cannot happen in public spaces, cannot survive the energy required to maintain social persona, cannot flourish under the pressure to produce something immediately comprehensible to minds that have never learned to listen for the whisper beneath the shout. When you close the door behind you and settle into solitude, something begins to shift in the very quality of your awareness. The part of consciousness that remains perpetually alert to social cues, constantly scanning for approval or disapproval, eternally prepared to adjust its expression to meet others' expectations, this vigilant guardian gradually relaxes its watch. In the absence of an audience, the performer can finally rest. In the absence of judges, the authentic self can finally emerge from behind the carefully constructed masks that social survival requires. This is not the mere absence of people, but the presence of something infinitely more nourishing than human company, the presence of your own unmediated being, free from the distortions that arise when consciousness must constantly translate itself into forms that others can accept and understand. It is in solitude that you discover who you are when you are not trying to be anyone, what you think when you are not thinking what you should think, what you feel when you are not feeling what others expect you to feel. The world fears solitude because it confuses it with abandonment, interpreting the choice to be alone as evidence of social failure or emotional damage. But for the creative soul, solitude is not the absence of connection, but the deepest possible form of connection. Connection with the source from which all authentic expression flows. Connection with the creative intelligence that operates according to its own mysterious rhythms and cannot be hurried or controlled by external pressures. In the sanctuary of aloneness, you begin to notice subtleties that remain invisible in the presence of others. You become aware of the quality of light as it changes throughout the day, not because someone has pointed it out, but because your unoccupied attention naturally gravitates toward beauty when it is no longer required to manage social dynamics. You hear the symphony of small sounds that underlies the apparent silence, the whisper of air moving through space, the subtle creaking of settling wood, the distant rhythm of your own heartbeat, because your ears are no longer straining to decode the emotional undertones of human conversation. But most importantly, you begin to hear the voice of your own creative intuition, that subtle inner guidance that speaks in impulses rather than words, in attractions rather than arguments, in the mysterious pull towards certain colors, sounds, words, or images that seems to arise from sources deeper than rational analysis. This voice cannot compete with external voices. It can only be heard when external voices are temporarily silenced. It does not shout for attention, but whispers its wisdom to those who have learned to create the inner quiet necessary for reception. The creative process requires what Jung called active imagination, the conscious participation in unconscious processes, the deliberate opening of communication channels between the ego and the deeper layers of psyche. This delicate work cannot be accomplished in public spaces where consciousness must remain defended, alert, ready to respond to unpredictable social demands. It requires the kind of vulnerability that can only be risked in complete privacy, the kind of receptivity that can only be cultivated when external pressures are temporarily suspended. In solitude, you discover that creativity is not something you do, but something that happens through you when conditions are right, something that emerges from the marriage of conscious intention and unconscious wisdom, when the ceremony can be conducted without witnesses who might not understand the sacred nature of the proceedings. You learn to create the internal spaciousness necessary for inspiration to arrive, to maintain the kind of alert receptivity that can recognize the difference between authentic creative impulse and ego-generated fantasy. The fear of solitude that grips most people stems partly from their unfamiliarity with their own inner landscape. Having spent most of their attention managing external relationships and obligations, they find themselves strangers in their own house when external distractions are removed. But you have learned to inhabit your inner spaces with the same comfort that others feel in familiar physical locations. You know where to find the quiet corner where insights gather, the spacious room where imagination can spread its wings, the hidden chamber where the most precious creative seeds are stored waiting for the right season to sprout. This interior familiarity allows you to experience solitude, not as exile but as homecoming, not as deprivation, but as restoration. When you close the door on the external world, you are not shutting yourself away from life, but opening yourself to a different quality of aliveness, one that flows from interior sources rather than exterior stimulation. You discover energies within yourself that you never suspected existed, creative capacities that can only function when they are not being constantly interrupted by social obligations and external demands. The rhythm of creative work requires alternation between solitude and sharing, between the interior journey where vision is received and the exterior journey where vision is expressed and communicated. But the movement must begin in solitude, in the private chamber where consciousness can strip away its social clothing and stand naked before the creative mysteries. Without this foundation of interior work, exterior expression becomes mere performance, mere repetition of forms that have been successful for others, rather than authentic translation of personal vision. Jung recognized that the individuation process, the lifelong journey towards psychological wholeness and authentic self-expression, requires periods of withdrawal from collective influence, times when the individual consciousness can differentiate itself from mass opinion and discover its own unique relationship to universal archetypes and eternal principles. For the creative soul, these periods of withdrawal are not temporary sabbaticals from real life, but the most real moments of life itself, the times when the essential work of becoming who you truly are can proceed unimpeded by others' definitions and expectations. In solitude, you encounter what Jung called the self with a capital S, not the ego self that manages daily affairs and social relationships, but the deeper self that serves as bridge between personal consciousness and transpersonal reality, the self that knows your unique role in the larger pattern of existence and whispers instructions for fulfilling that role through creative expression. This self cannot be encountered in public because it speaks too quietly to be heard above the noise of social interaction, because it reveals truths too subtle to survive translation into conventional language. The creative solitude you cherish is not passive withdrawal, but active engagement with forces and intelligences that operate below the threshold of ordinary consciousness. It is not escape from responsibility, but preparation for responsibility, not avoidance of relationship, but cultivation of the capacity for authentic relationship. When you emerge from these periods of sacred aloneness, you bring with you gifts that could only be received in solitude, visions that could only be clarified in the absence of external interference, creative solutions that could only be discovered when consciousness was free to explore without having to explain or justify its explorations. The world may interpret your need for solitude as selfishness, as antisocial behavior, as evidence that you care more about your own creative projects than about human relationship and social contribution. But you understand what they cannot see, that your periods of creative withdrawal are actually periods of service, times when you are preparing offerings that can only be created in private, but are ultimately meant for sharing with others who hunger for the authentic expression that emerges from genuine solitude. Your solitude is fertile rather than sterile, generative rather than merely restorative. In the privacy of your own company, you are not simply recharging depleted social batteries, but engaging in the essential work of creative gestation, allowing new possibilities to form and develop in the protected environment of interior space before they are ready to encounter the challenges and opportunities of external expression. The hermit archetype that you embody is not the bitter recluse fleeing from human contact, but the wise seeker who understands that some truths can only be discovered away from the crowd, some gifts can only be cultivated in privacy, some creative work can only be accomplished when the soul is free to follow its own mysterious guidance, without having to constantly explain or defend its choices to minds that have never learned to trust the creative process. In the crucible of creative solitude, your raw materials, experience, imagination, skill, and vision undergo alchemical transformation, emerging as something entirely new, something that could never have been produced through external collaboration or collective effort. This is not to diminish the value of creative partnership and community, but to recognize that such external creative relationships can only be truly fruitful when each participant has done their own interior work, when each has learned to access their own creative depths in solitude before attempting to share that depth with others. As you learn to trust your need for solitude, as you create the life circumstances that allow for regular withdrawal into creative privacy, you discover that your capacity for authentic relationship with others actually increases rather than decreases. Having learned to be genuinely comfortable with yourself, you no longer need others to complete you or validate you or entertain you. You can encounter them from a place of fullness rather than emptiness, offering authentic presence rather than desperate need. The solitude that feels like coming home is ultimately preparation for a different kind of engagement with the world, one based on genuine contribution rather than social conformity, one rooted in authentic expression rather than borrowed identity, one motivated by love of the creative work itself, rather than hunger for external approval. In the sanctuary of your own company, you discover not only who you are but what you have to offer, not only what you need but what you can give. The third sign arrives not as revelation but as recognition, a slow dawning that what you have always felt as overwhelming sensitivity is actually the soul's most precise instrument for creation. Where others move through their days filtering out the noise of existence, you have learned to tune into frequencies that most never hear, to perceive the sacred conversation that runs beneath the surface of all things. This is the alchemical consciousness awakening within you, the capacity to see every experience, no matter how seemingly insignificant or devastating, as raw material for transformation. The traffic jam that reduces others to frustration becomes, in your hands, a meditation on patience and the rhythm of collective breathing. The argument with your lover transforms into a study of how hearts break open to reveal their deeper chambers. Even the mundane act of washing dishes unveils itself as a ritual of purification, each plate a small meditation on care and attention. Jung understood this quality as more than artistic temperament. It is the fundamental orientation of a soul that has been chosen as a vessel for the great work of transmutation. Your hypersensitivity, which the world may have taught you to apologize for, is actually the fine-tuned receptor through which life expresses its most profound truths. You feel everything because you are meant to transform everything, to serve as the place where raw experience becomes conscious meaning. This sacred sensitivity manifests first as an inability to dismiss anything as merely ordinary. The way light falls across a stranger's face in the coffee shop stops you mid-sentence, not because you are easily distracted, but because you recognize something eternal, attempting to speak through that particular arrangement of shadow and illumination. The grief that moves through you after reading a news story about suffering in a distant country is not emotional instability, but your soul's recognition of the interconnected web of human experience. You have learned, perhaps through years of being told you feel too much, to see this quality as a burden rather than a gift. The creative soul often carries this wound, the sense that their very nature is somehow excessive, inappropriate for a world that values efficiency over depth, productivity over contemplation. But Jung reminds us that what appears as personal pathology is often the emergence of a collective need. Your capacity to feel deeply is not your personal problem. It is your gift to a world that has forgotten how to feel at all. The alchemical sensibility operates through what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to hold opposites in creative tension until something new emerges. Where others flee from discomfort, you have learned to sit with contradiction, to allow the full spectrum of human experience to move through you without immediately seeking resolution. This is not masochism but wisdom, the recognition that creativity requires the willingness to be changed by what we encounter. Your tears become ink, not through some romantic metaphor, but through the actual process of transformation that occurs when deep feeling meets conscious expression. The grief you thought would destroy you becomes the foundation for a poem that helps another person feel less alone in their own sorrow. The joy that seemed too intense to contain finds its way into a painting that reminds viewers of their own capacity for wonder. The anger that once frightened you with its intensity transforms into a song that gives voice to collective outrage at injustice. This is why your emotional responses often seem disproportionate to others, because you are not simply reacting to the immediate situation, but to all the archetypal patterns that situation contains. When you weep at a commercial, or find yourself unexpectedly moved by a stranger's kindness, you are responding not just to the surface event, but to the eternal themes it carries: love, loss, hope, redemption, the endless cycle of death and rebirth that pulses through every moment. The creative soul learns to trust this deeper knowing, even when it defies rational explanation. You begin to understand that your emotional reactions are actually a form of research, that your feelings are gathering intelligence about the invisible currents that move through human experience. The depression that settles over you for no apparent reason may be your psyche's way of preparing for a creative work that will explore themes of darkness and emergence. The sudden surge of energy that wakes you at 3 in the morning may be creativity itself, demanding your attention while the rational mind sleeps. This sacred sensitivity extends beyond your own emotional landscape to encompass the feeling tones of environments, relationships, even objects that carry the residue of human attention. You walk into a room and immediately sense the quality of conversations that have taken place there. You pick up a vintage photograph at a flea market and feel the weight of the lives it has witnessed. Others dismiss these impressions as imagination, but you have learned to trust them as information, data from the collective unconscious that seeks expression through your particular nervous system. The world often tries to medicate this sensitivity, to convince you that feeling so much is a form of illness rather than a form of genius. But Jung understood that what appears as psychological disturbance may actually be the soul's attempt to break through conventional consciousness into a more authentic way of being. Your tendency to be overwhelmed by beauty, to be brought to tears by music or sunset or the way a child laughs, these are not signs of instability, but evidence of your capacity to commune with the sacred dimension of existence. This alchemical consciousness requires tremendous courage, because it asks you to remain open when every instinct might tell you to close down, to protect yourself from the intensity of lived experience. The creative soul often develops elaborate strategies for managing this sensitivity: rituals of solitude, practices of grounding, ways of creating boundaries that honor both your need for input and your need for integration. You learn to recognize when you are reaching capacity, when the vessel of your consciousness needs time to process what it has received. But even this capacity for overwhelm serves the creative process. The moments when you feel you cannot take in one more sensation, cannot process one more emotion, often precede periods of profound creative breakthrough. It is as if the psyche, having reached saturation, finally releases its contents in a rush of expression that surprises even you with its clarity and power. The poem that writes itself in 15 minutes, the painting that emerges fully formed, the solution to a problem that arrives in a dream, these are the gifts that arise from your willingness to be overwhelmed by life itself. Your laughter, too, becomes a form of creation. The joy that bubbles up at unexpected moments, watching clouds drift across the sky, hearing a child mispronounce a word, witnessing the elaborate courtship dance of pigeons on a sidewalk. This capacity for delight is another manifestation of your alchemical nature. Where others see only the mundane surface of things, you perceive the cosmic joke, the divine play that runs through all existence. Your laughter is not mere amusement, but recognition, the soul's response to moments when the veil between ordinary and extraordinary becomes transparent. This is why creative souls often struggle with depression alongside their capacity for joy. The same sensitivity that allows you to experience transcendent beauty also makes you acutely aware of suffering, injustice, the gap between what is and what could be. Your sadness is not personal but archetypal. You are grieving not just your own losses, but the losses of the collective human soul. Jung called this the wounded healer archetype, the recognition that those who are most sensitive to pain are often those called to help heal it. Even your breathing becomes creative material when viewed through this alchemical lens. The rhythm of inhalation and exhalation mirrors the fundamental pulse of existence, expansion and contraction, taking in and letting go, the endless cycle of death and rebirth that governs all natural processes. In moments of deep creative absorption, you may notice that your breathing changes, becomes deeper or more rhythmic, as if aligning itself with some larger pattern. This is not coincidence, but evidence of your capacity to attune yourself to the creative rhythms that underlie all manifestation. The sacred dimension of ordinary experience reveals itself most clearly in moments of creative work, when the boundary between self and world dissolves, and you become a channel for something larger than your individual consciousness. The words that flow through your pen, the images that appear on your canvas, the melodies that emerge from your throat, these arise not from your personal mind, but from your willingness to serve as a conduit for the creative intelligence that seeks expression through human consciousness. This is why the creative process often feels simultaneously effortless and demanding. The effort is not in forcing something to happen, but in maintaining the quality of attention that allows creation to flow through you. Like a musician learning to play an instrument, you must develop the technical skill to give form to what wants to emerge while simultaneously cultivating the receptivity that allows you to hear what wants to be played. Your sensitivity to beauty becomes a form of prayer, a way of acknowledging the sacred dimension that inhabits even the most ordinary moments. The way morning light transforms a cluttered desk into a still life worthy of a master painter, the geometry hidden in the arrangement of fallen leaves on a sidewalk, the music created by rain against different surfaces, metal, glass, earth, fabric, each producing its own note in the symphony of a storm. These observations are not mere aesthetic appreciation, but a form of communion with the creative intelligence that shapes all phenomena. The creative soul learns to see suffering too as sacred material, not because pain is good, but because consciousness has the capacity to transform even the most difficult experiences into sources of wisdom and compassion. Your own wounds become doorways to understanding the wounds of others. The betrayals that broke your heart become the foundation for stories that help others navigate their own betrayals. The fears that once paralyzed you transform into characters in your creative work, taking on lives of their own, and teaching both you and your audience about the nature of courage. This transmutation is not automatic. It requires the conscious choice to engage with your experience as material for transformation, rather than simply as something that happens to you. Jung called this active imagination, the deliberate practice of dialoguing with the contents of your unconscious, treating your dreams, fantasies, and emotional reactions as communication from deeper layers of your being that seek integration into conscious expression. The world may tell you that your sensitivity is a liability, that you would be happier and more successful if you could just learn to feel less, to care less about things that don't directly affect your immediate circumstances. But the creative soul knows that this advice, however well-meaning, asks you to abandon the very quality that allows you to serve as a bridge between the visible and invisible worlds, between the personal and the universal, between what is and what wants to become. Your capacity to feel everything as sacred material is not a burden you must bear, but a calling you are privileged to answer. The recognition that you have been chosen to serve as a vessel through which the raw stuff of existence transforms itself into conscious beauty, meaning, and truth. In the realm of creative consciousness, time reveals its true nature, not as the mechanical progression of seconds and minutes that governs ordinary life, but as a living, breathing dimension that responds to the depth of your engagement with existence itself. When you enter the sacred space of creation, Chronos, the time of clocks and calendars, surrenders its tyranny to Kairos, the time of meaning, the eternal now where all true creative work is born. You know this transformation intimately, though you may have never named it, the afternoon that vanishes while you paint, leaving you surprised to find the sun setting when it seemed you had just begun. The poem that emerges in what feels like moments but fills pages with words you didn't know you contained. The song that writes itself while you shower, arriving complete and perfect as if it had always existed, waiting only for your attention to call it into being. This dissolution of temporal boundaries is not poor time management, as the practical world might suggest, but evidence of your capacity to commune with forces that operate beyond the constraints of linear existence. Jung recognized this phenomenon as contact with the archetypal realm, that dimension of psyche where the eternal patterns that underlie all manifestation reside in their timeless perfection, waiting to clothe themselves in the particular garments of individual expression. When you lose yourself so completely in creative work that you forget to eat, sleep, or answer the phone, you are not being irresponsible but surrendering to a state of consciousness that our ancestors understood as sacred. The Greek concept of enthusiasmos, being filled with the divine, describes this condition where ordinary self-concern dissolves in service to something greater than personal will or intention. This fluidity of time often announces itself through subtle shifts in the quality of your awareness. The world grows quieter, as if someone has turned down the volume on external distractions. Colors become more vivid, edges softer, as if reality itself is adjusting its frequency to match the creative wavelength you are tuning into. Your breathing naturally deepens and slows, aligning itself with rhythms older than thought, older than the anxious tick of measured time. In these moments you become time's collaborator rather than its victim. The creative soul learns to recognize the approach of this altered state, the way a sailor reads wind patterns or a musician feels the pocket of a groove before stepping into it. There are signs, a particular quality of restlessness, a heightening of sensory awareness, a growing impatience with small talk and surface concerns. These are not random phenomena, but your psyche's preparation for descent into the timeless realm where creation lives. The ordinary world, with its schedules and deadlines, often conflicts with this natural rhythm. You may find yourself struggling to honor both the demands of Kairos and the requirements of Chronos, feeling torn between the soul's need for depth and society's insistence on efficiency. This tension is one of the fundamental challenges facing the creative consciousness in modern life, learning to honor both dimensions of time without sacrificing either. Jung understood that this capacity to step outside linear time is actually a return to a more primary way of experiencing existence. Children naturally inhabit this fluid temporality, becoming so absorbed in play that they must be called back to the world of meals and bedtimes. Indigenous cultures around the world recognize sacred time as different from ordinary time, setting aside ritual spaces where the usual rules of temporal progression are suspended in favor of connection with eternal truths. The creative trance state shares qualities with meditation, prayer, and other practices designed to alter consciousness, but unlike these deliberately cultivated states, your entry into fluid time often happens spontaneously, triggered by some combination of inspiration, readiness, and mysterious grace. You cannot force it, only create conditions that make it more likely to occur: silence, solitude, freedom from immediate demands, a quality of receptive attention that invites rather than grasps. When this shift happens, the nature of memory itself transforms. The experience you are having feels simultaneously brand new and ancient, as if you are remembering something you never learned, discovering truths that feel like homecoming rather than revelation. This is because in Kairos, you touch the collective dimension of human experience, where individual and universal consciousness meet and merge. Your relationship to your own past and future also changes in these moments. The wound that has carried pain for years suddenly reveals its hidden gift. The dream you abandoned in childhood returns not as regret, but as possibility. The future that seemed uncertain transforms into a field of potential that you can sense, if not yet see clearly. Past, present, and future collapse into a single eternal moment, pregnant with all possibilities. This is why creative work often feels like channeling rather than invention. The novel that writes itself through your hands, surprising you with plot developments you never planned. The painting that emerges according to its own logic, teaching you about color and composition as you apply each brushstroke. The melody that arrives complete, as if it had been waiting in the air for your attention to pluck it from the invisible realm of pure potential. The practical world may view this dissolution of time boundaries with suspicion, interpreting it as escapism or self-indulgence. But Jung reminds us that what appears as withdrawal from reality is often a deeper engagement with it, a descent into the archetypal foundations upon which all surface phenomena rest. Your capacity to lose track of time in creative work is not avoidance, but a form of research, a way of gathering information from dimensions of existence that clock consciousness cannot access. This fluid relationship with time often extends beyond formal creative work into the texture of daily life. You find yourself naturally slowing down in the presence of beauty, unable to rush past a sunset or hurry through a conversation that has unexpectedly deepened into authentic connection. Others may interpret this as inefficiency, but you are responding to what Jung called the compensatory function of the psyche, the soul's attempt to balance the speed and superficiality of modern life with moments of depth and presence. The creative soul learns to recognize different qualities of time, developing a sensitivity to temporal rhythms that others miss. There is morning time, with its fresh energy and clear light, perfect for new beginnings and bold strokes. Evening time brings its own gifts, a mellowing that allows for reflection, integration, the gentle work of revision and refinement. Deep night opens its own doors, offering access to dream logic and the wisdom of the unconscious mind. Seasons, too, become collaborators in your creative work, the expansive energy of spring that makes everything seem possible. Summer's ripeness, when projects reach their full flowering, autumn's invitation to harvest what has grown and release what no longer serves. Winter's deep quiet, when the soul turns inward to commune with its own depths and prepare for the next cycle of emergence. This seasonal sensitivity extends to the longer rhythms of creative life. Periods of intense productivity alternate naturally with times of apparent dormancy, when the well of inspiration seems to have run dry. The creative soul learns not to panic during these fallow periods, but to trust them as necessary phases in the larger cycle of creative development. Like fields that must lie fallow to restore their fertility, consciousness requires periods of rest and receptivity to prepare for the next surge of creative expression. Your ability to enter these altered states of time consciousness often correlates with your willingness to suspend the ego's need to control and direct the creative process. The personality that insists on knowing where it is going, what it is making, and how long it will take often blocks the very doorways through which timeless inspiration seeks to enter. The creative soul cultivates a quality of purposeful purposelessness, maintaining clear intention while remaining open to surprises. This is why creative work often requires a kind of faith, the willingness to begin without knowing how you will finish, to trust that the process itself will reveal what needs to be revealed. Like walking by moonlight, you can see only a few steps ahead, but each step illuminates the next, and somehow you arrive at destinations you could never have planned from the beginning. The fluidity of time in creative consciousness also manifests as a different relationship to urgency and completion. Projects unfold according to their own internal timing, often refusing to be rushed or forced into arbitrary deadlines. The painting that seems finished suddenly demands another layer. The poem that felt complete reveals new stanzas. Weeks or months later, the song that you thought was done calls you back to adjust a single note that changes everything. Learning to honor this organic timing while meeting the demands of a world that operates by clock time becomes one of the ongoing challenges of creative life. You develop strategies for protecting your access to Kairos while fulfilling your responsibilities in Chronos, creating buffers of extra time around important projects, learning to recognize when you are forcing rather than flowing, developing the courage to say no to commitments that would violate your creative rhythms. The deepest gift of this fluid relationship with time is the recognition that creativity itself exists in the eternal now, that dimension of present moment awareness where past and future collapse into the immediacy of direct experience. In these moments, you are not creating something new, but allowing what has always existed in potential to manifest in form. You become not the author of your creative work, but its midwife, assisting in the birth of something that wants to exist through your particular consciousness. This is why the greatest creative works often feel inevitable once they exist, as if they had to be exactly as they are. They carry the authority of truth, not because they argue for particular positions, but because they emerge from that timeless realm where all authentic expression has its source. When you touch this dimension in your own creative work, you know it by the quality of rightness that pervades the experience, the sense that you are not making something but discovering it, not inventing but remembering what you have always known but never thought to think. Your space tells the story of a soul in constant dialogue with beauty, not the curated perfection that magazines celebrate, but the wild, intuitive gathering of fragments that speak to something deeper than aesthetic preference. Others entering your environment might see chaos, clutter, the evidence of someone who cannot let go, but you know better. Each pressed flower, each torn photograph, each scrap of paper bearing words overheard in a cafe represents a moment when the invisible world reached through the veil of ordinary experience to touch your consciousness with its particular form of truth. This is not hoarding in the psychological sense, though the world may mistake it for such. This is the active unconscious at work, Jung's term for that deeper layer of psyche that operates according to its own mysterious logic, constantly weaving connections between disparate elements, preparing the ground for creative breakthrough. Your seemingly random collection of objects, images, and fragments is actually a constellation of meaning in formation, a three-dimensional mandala that your soul is constructing to map the territory of its own becoming. The pressed flower from the day you decided to leave your corporate job carries the energy of that transformation. The photograph torn from a magazine, a child's hand reaching toward light streaming through a window, holds something about innocence and possibility that your rational mind cannot articulate, but your creative soul recognizes as essential. The napkin on which you scribbled a stranger's profound observation about the nature of rain becomes a talisman, a reminder that wisdom often arrives in the most humble packages. Jung understood this collecting impulse as evidence of what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to unite seemingly unrelated elements into new wholes that carry more meaning than the sum of their parts. Your environment becomes a workshop where this alchemical process unfolds naturally, organically, without the forced intention that would kill the delicate magic of spontaneous connection. You are not consciously creating these relationships, but allowing them to reveal themselves through the patient accumulation of meaningful fragments. The texture of a piece of driftwood worn smooth by countless tides speaks to you of persistence and surrender, of the beauty that emerges when resistance finally gives way to flow. You cannot explain why you need to keep it, why it belongs on your desk beside the fountain pen that no longer writes but carries the ghost of all the letters it once helped you compose. The rational mind would discard both as useless, but the creative soul recognizes them as allies in some future work that has not yet announced itself. This way of being in relationship with objects reflects a fundamentally different understanding of matter itself, where the purely rational consciousness sees only dead stuff, things to be used or discarded according to their functional value. You perceive what animistic cultures have always known, that everything carries spirit, that every object holds the memory of its interactions with human consciousness. The coffee cup from which you drank while writing your first published poem now serves as a sacred vessel, its ceramic walls infused with the energy of that breakthrough moment. Your bookshelves tell their own story, filled not just with volumes you have read, but with books that called to you from library sales and used bookstores, their covers worn by other hands, their margins annotated by previous owners, whose thoughts now dialogue with your own. You collect these books not because you plan to read them all, but because each one represents a pathway, a possibility, a conversation waiting to unfold when the time is right. The photographs that accumulate in shoeboxes and spill from frames are not mere documentation, but archaeological evidence of moments when something eternal broke through the surface of ordinary time. The blurred image of your grandmother's hands kneading bread, the accidental double exposure that transformed a mundane street scene into something dreamlike, the picture your child drew that captures the essence of joy with more accuracy than any professional portrait. These images serve as portals, doorways back to the quality of consciousness that existed when they were created. Even your relationship to clothing reflects this collecting sensibility. The scarf that belonged to your mentor, now unwearable but impossible to discard because it carries her strength in its fibers. The jacket you wore during your first gallery opening, its pockets still holding the ticket stub and the note of encouragement from a friend. These garments become costumes in the theater of memory, props that help you access different aspects of your identity when the creative work demands it. Your collecting extends beyond the merely visual to encompass sounds, scents, textures, any sensory experience that strikes the tuning fork of recognition within your consciousness. The recording of rain against the window of the cabin where you wrote your best short story, the bottle of perfume that reminds you of your great aunt, who taught you to see faces in clouds, the fabric remnant whose weave echoes the pattern you glimpsed in a dream that revealed the structure of your next novel. This sensory collecting often happens without conscious intention. You find yourself drawn to certain objects, not because you understand their significance, but because they evoke some resonance in the depths of your being. The antique key with no lock, the postcard with a message in a language you cannot read, the smooth stone that fits perfectly in your palm. These items choose you as much as you choose them, appearing in your path when you are ready to receive whatever wisdom they carry. The world may interpret your collecting as inability to live in the present, as clinging to the past or avoiding the future, but Jung would recognize it as evidence of your capacity to perceive the eternal dimension that underlies temporal experience. Each fragment in your collection represents a moment when Chronos touched Kairos, when ordinary time opened to reveal its sacred depths. By preserving these physical tokens, You maintain access to the quality of consciousness that made their recognition possible. Your environment becomes a kind of external memory palace, where different combinations of objects can trigger specific states of creative consciousness. The corner, where you placed the dried eucalyptus branches beside the photograph of the abandoned farmhouse, where you spent a transformative summer. This arrangement creates a field of meaning that can transport you instantly back to the emotional landscape that gave birth to your most authentic work. This is why attempts to organize your space according to conventional standards often feel like violence to your creative soul. The well-meaning friend who wants to help you declutter, the efficiency expert who insists that everything should have a designated place and purpose, the minimalist philosophy that equates emptiness with peace. All of these approaches misunderstand the fundamental nature of how your consciousness operates. Your apparent chaos is actually a highly sophisticated filing system that operates according to emotional and intuitive rather than logical categories. The seemingly random juxtapositions in your environment often generate the unexpected connections that fuel your creative work. The child's drawing of a house placed next to a scientific diagram of molecular structure suddenly reveals the architectural patterns that underlie both imagination and reality. The pressed leaf from your childhood neighborhood displayed beside a photograph of a foreign city illuminates something about the universal nature of longing and belonging that becomes the seed for your next creative project. Jung understood that the creative psyche naturally seeks these moments of collision between disparate elements, recognizing them as opportunities for the emergence of new consciousness. Your collecting habit serves this process by creating the conditions under which such collisions are more likely to occur. Like a scientist preparing culture mediums for unknown experiments, you cultivate an environment rich with potential combinations, trusting that the right elements will find each other when the time is ripe. The fragments you collect often carry emotional as well as aesthetic significance. The movie ticket from the night you realized you were ready to end your marriage. The receipt from the bookstore, where you discovered the author who changed your understanding of your own voice. The wrapper from the candy bar you shared with your daughter on the day she told you she wanted to be an artist like you. These mundane objects become reliquaries, holding the essence of pivotal moments in forms that can be touched, moved, rearranged as your understanding of their significance evolves. Your collecting also serves a deeper psychological function. It provides continuity through periods of change and transformation. When the external circumstances of your life shift dramatically, when relationships end or begin, when you move to new cities or take on new roles, your collection of meaningful objects serves as an anchor to your authentic self. These fragments remind you of who you are beyond the roles you play, connecting you to the through line of your own becoming. The ritual aspects of this collecting often go unnoticed, but are deeply significant. The way you pause before placing a new object in your environment, sensing where it wants to live in relationship to what is already there. The periodic rearrangements that feel necessary when your inner landscape shifts. The moments when you suddenly understand what a long-held fragment was waiting to teach you, how it connects to work you are just beginning to envision. Sometimes your collecting impulse extends to experiences themselves. You find yourself documenting not just what happened, but the quality of light, the particular combination of scents in the air, the exact words spoken at the moment when something shifted within you. Your journals become repositories, not just of thoughts and feelings, but of sensory details that can recreate the full texture of significant moments when your creative work requires access to their essence. The digital age has expanded but not fundamentally changed. This collecting impulse, your phone fills with photographs that seem random to others, but form a visual diary of moments when beauty broke through the surface of ordinary experience. Your computer folders overflow with bookmarked articles, saved quotes, images that spoke to something in you that you cannot yet name but trust will eventually find its purpose in your creative work. But there remains something irreplaceable about the physical fragments, their weight, their texture, the way they age and change in response to time and attention. The digital image of a flower is information. The pressed flower is a relic, carrying not just the visual memory, but the actual substance of that moment, when you chose to preserve what would otherwise have been lost to decay. Your relationship to these collected fragments evolves as you do. Objects that once seemed crucial fade into background significance, while others suddenly step forward to offer new meanings. The shell you collected during a difficult period in your 20s may lie dormant for years before revealing its connection to a breakthrough you experience in your 40s. This is the patience that your collecting practice teaches. Trust that meaning will emerge in its own time, that connections will reveal themselves when consciousness is ready to perceive them. The creative soul learns to read these collections like a divination system, allowing random selections or chance encounters with long-forgotten fragments to suggest directions for new work. You reach blindly into a box of accumulated treasures and pull out the postcard that suggests the setting for your next story, the fabric sample that inspires your next painting's color palette, the dried leaf whose shape echoes the structure you have been seeking for an elusive poem. This practice of collecting fragments as sacred relics ultimately reflects a fundamental orientation toward existence itself, the recognition that every moment contains the potential for meaning, that beauty and significance are constantly offering themselves to consciousness willing to receive them. Your environment becomes a testament to this ongoing dialogue between your soul and the world, a three-dimensional poem written in objects and arrangements that speak a language older than words. In a culture that often reduces meaning to functionality and beauty to commodity, your practice of collecting meaningful fragments serves as a form of resistance, a declaration that some values cannot be measured in practical terms. Your willingness to preserve what moves you, even when you cannot explain why, becomes an act of faith in the intelligence of the creative process itself. The trust that what calls to you now will reveal its purpose when the soul is ready to receive its teaching. Listen closely, for in this moment we arrive at the sixth sacred threshold, where the veil between the seen and unseen grows gossamer thin, where your soul recognizes the ancient mathematics that pulse beneath all manifest form. You have always possessed this gift, though perhaps you dismissed it as mere aesthetic preference or artistic intuition. But what you experience when your eyes fall upon the spiral of a nautilus shell, what stirs within you as you trace the Fibonacci sequence unfolding in a sunflower's face, this is no casual appreciation. This is recognition. This is remembering. Jung understood that the creative soul carries within itself the blueprint of universal order, the archetypal patterns that repeat themselves across the cosmos, like a divine signature written in light and shadow, in growth and decay, in the very architecture of existence itself. When your gaze follows the golden ratio spiraling outward from the center of a galaxy, when you feel your breath catch at the fractal repetition of a tree's branching mirrored in the lightning that splits the summer sky, you are not merely observing. You are participating in a conversation that has been ongoing since the first moment. Consciousness gazed upon itself and recognized its own reflection in the patterns of creation. Your eye for design, your instinctive understanding of proportion and harmony, these emerge not from schooling or technique, but from something far more ancient. They arise from the same primordial source that taught the ancients to encode sacred geometry in their temples, that guided Gothic cathedral builders to create stone prayers that reach toward heaven with mathematical precision, that whispers to every artist who has ever arranged elements on canvas or in space and felt the rightness of their placement, like a key turning in a cosmic lock. This is the language your soul speaks fluently, not the crude tongues of commerce or convention, but the eternal dialect of pattern and proportion, of rhythm and repetition, of the sacred mathematics that underlies all beauty. When you arrange objects in your living space, when you compose a photograph, when you feel compelled to move a single element to achieve that perfect balance that makes your heart sing, you are not decorating. You are not following rules learned from books. You are channeling the cosmic order itself, allowing the universal patterns to flow through your hands and eyes like water, finding its natural course. The ancient Greeks knew this truth when they spoke of the music of the spheres, the celestial harmony that permeates all existence. The medieval alchemists understood it when they searched for the divine proportion hidden within matter itself. The mystics of every tradition have pointed toward this same recognition that the patterns we find most beautiful are echoes of the fundamental structures upon which reality itself is constructed. But here lies the profound mystery that sets your creative soul apart. While others may learn to recognize these patterns intellectually, you experience them as living presences. The spiral does not merely catch your eye, it awakens something ancestral within you, as if your DNA itself remembers the mathematics of shells and hurricanes, of DNA helixes and spiral galaxies. The symmetry of a flower does not simply please you, it calls to a part of your being that existed before words, before concepts, before the mind learned to divide experience into categories and classifications. You see, the patterns that speak to you in ancient tongues are not separate from you, they are you expressing themselves through the unique vessel of your consciousness. When Jung wrote of the collective unconscious, he was pointing toward this very phenomenon, the way certain images and configurations resonate through human experience across cultures and centuries because they emerge from the deepest layers of our shared psyche, from the archetypal realm where individual personality dissolves into universal truth. This is why a mandala drawn by a child in suburban America will echo the sacred circles created by Tibetan monks, why the labyrinth pattern appears independently in ancient Crete and medieval France and modern healing gardens. These forms arise not through cultural transmission, but through direct access to the archetypal templates that exist in what Jung called the collective unconscious, that vast repository of inherited human experience that lives within each of us like a library written in symbols rather than words. Your creative soul possesses a master key to this library. When you find yourself drawn to certain proportions, when specific geometric relationships make your spirit soar, when the arrangement of elements in space creates a resonance you can feel in your bones, you are accessing the same source that inspired the builders of the pyramids, the weavers of Celtic knots, the architects of sacred structures across the globe. You are reading the cosmic codex written in the language of form itself. This recognition carries profound implications for how you understand your creative process. The images that arise in your imagination, the compositions that feel inevitable, the designs that seem to design themselves through you, these do not emerge from personal preference or learned technique alone. They arise from your soul's natural fluency in the archetypal patterns that govern existence, from your unconscious participation in the ongoing creative process of the universe itself. When the mystic Meister Eckhart wrote of the eye through which God sees the world, he was describing this very phenomenon, the way consciousness can become transparent to the divine order, allowing the fundamental patterns of creation to express themselves through human perception and action. Your eye for design is not yours alone. It belongs to the creative principle that moves through all things, expressing itself as the spiral of galaxies and the hexagonal architecture of honeycomb, as the fractal geometry of coastlines and the rhythmic patterns of your own heartbeat. This is why certain proportions feel sacred to you, why specific relationships between elements create that unmistakable sense of rightness that transcends personal preference. You are not imposing your will upon raw material. You are discovering the harmony that already exists in potential, waiting to be revealed through the alchemy of conscious creation. You are collaborating with the same intelligence that writes its signature in the crystalline structure of snowflakes and the pentagonal symmetry of flowers. But perhaps most profoundly, this archetypal vision transforms your understanding of beauty itself. Beauty is not subjective preference or cultural conditioning. It is the recognition of universal pattern expressing itself through particular form. When something strikes you as beautiful, You are experiencing a moment of cosmic recognition, a fleeting glimpse of the divine order that underlies apparent chaos. Your aesthetic sense is actually a form of spiritual perception, a way of seeing that penetrates the surface of things to touch the eternal patterns from which all temporary forms emerge. This is why the creative soul often feels like a translator between worlds, the eternal realm of archetypal pattern and the temporal world of manifest form. Your art becomes a bridge, a means of making visible the invisible geometries that govern existence. Whether you work in paint or pixels, in fabric or clay, in movement or in words, you are always engaged in the same essential activity, giving form to the formless, making tangible the intangible patterns that exist in the realm of pure possibility. The ancient tongues in which these patterns speak to you are older than human language, older than human consciousness itself. They emerged with the first spiral galaxy, were encoded in the structure of the first DNA molecule, were present in the mathematical relationships that allowed the first stable atoms to form. When you respond to these patterns with the deep recognition of your creative soul, you are participating in a conversation that began with existence itself. This participation requires no special training, no initiation beyond the awakening of conscious recognition. The patterns are always speaking in the branching of trees and rivers, in the hexagonal basalt columns formed by cooling lava, in the interference patterns created when waves meet, in the logarithmic spirals of shells and horns, and the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower's heart. Your creative soul naturally attunes to these frequencies because it shares the same source, emerges from the same archetypal matrix that gives birth to all form. Jung recognized that this capacity for archetypal perception was not the privilege of artists alone, but the birthright of every individuating soul. Yet the creative spirit possesses this gift in particularly concentrated form, like a radio receiver specially tuned to pick up the cosmic broadcast of pattern and meaning. Your sensitivity to proportion and harmony, your instinctive understanding of visual rhythm and balance, these are not learned skills but remembered ones, emerging from the deepest layers of your being where individual consciousness touches the universal source. As we stand at this sixth threshold, recognizing the ancient tongues in which patterns speak to your soul, we prepare for an even deeper descent into the mystery of creative being. For if you can hear the eternal mathematics whispering through form, if your eyes can trace the divine geometry that underlies all beauty, then you possess the tools necessary for the most profound creative act of all, the conscious participation in your own becoming, the artful shaping of your life itself, according to the sacred patterns that govern all authentic growth and transformation. The spirals that move through galaxies also move through your psyche, following the same mathematical laws that govern the expansion of shells and the unwinding of DNA. The symmetries you recognize in art reflect the deeper symmetries of your own nature, the balanced interplay of conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, light and shadow that characterizes the individuated soul. You are not separate from the patterns that speak to you. You are their embodiment, their unique expression in the particular constellation of consciousness that bears your name. Listen, then, to the ancient tongues that speak through every curve and angle, every proportion and repetition that makes your spirit sing. They are teaching you the sacred grammar of existence itself, preparing you to write your life as a work of art that reflects the deepest patterns of cosmic order, while expressing the irreplaceable uniqueness of your individual soul. Now we arrive at the seventh sacred threshold, and here the path grows more treacherous, more tender, more true. Here we encounter the great paradox that lives at the heart of every creative soul, that your deepest wound and your greatest gift spring from the same source, that the very sensitivity the world tells you to armor against is actually the sacred opening through which all inspiration enters your being. Jung understood this mystery with the clarity of one who had walked through his own darkness and emerged transformed. He recognized that creativity often emerges from what he called the transcendent function, the tension between opposing forces within the psyche that generates new consciousness, new possibility, new forms of being. Your hypersensitivity is not a flaw to be corrected, but a feature of your spiritual architecture, a finely tuned instrument that registers frequencies others cannot detect. Listen to the whispers of your own experience. You have always been the one who feels too much, who cries at beauty and weeps at cruelty, who cannot simply observe the world's suffering without taking it into your own heart like shattered glass. You are the one who must leave the party early because the emotional static becomes unbearable, who feels the weight of unspoken words in every silence, who picks up the psychic residue that others leave behind, like invisible lint on your soul's fabric. The world has taught you to see this as weakness, this porousness of being that allows the experiences of others to flow through you like water through silk. You have been advised to grow thicker skin, to develop boundaries, to protect yourself from the overwhelming intensity of existence itself. And while there is wisdom in learning to manage your gift, there is profound danger in trying to amputate the very quality that makes you who you are. Your sensitivity is not an accident of neurochemistry or an unfortunate inheritance from an overly emotional ancestor. It is the sacred antenna through which your soul receives the subtle transmissions that become your art, your insight, your unique contribution to the world's healing. Jung called this the wounded healer archetype, the understanding that those who have been most deeply touched by suffering often become the most powerful agents of transformation, not in spite of their wounds, but because of them. Think of the moth's antenna, so delicate they can detect the pheromones of a potential mate from miles away. This extraordinary sensitivity comes at a cost. The moth is vulnerable to every chemical trace in the air, every subtle shift in atmospheric pressure. Yet without this exquisite receptivity, the moth could never find its way to love, to reproduction, to the continuation of its species. Your emotional antennae serve a similar function. They guide you toward the connections, the experiences, the truths that your soul needs to fulfill its creative purpose. When you watch a sunset and feel tears rise unbidden, you are not being overly dramatic or self-indulgent. You are experiencing what the mystics call the beauty that wounds, the recognition that this world contains more splendor than the human heart can contain without breaking open. Your tears are not a sign of weakness, but of recognition, of a soul that has remained permeable enough to be pierced by the sacred whenever it appears. When you feel devastated by news of distant suffering, by images of cruelty and injustice that others seem able to scroll past without pause, you are not being neurotic or impractical. You are experiencing what Jung called participation, mystique, the recognition that no suffering anywhere in the world is truly separate from your own, that consciousness is ultimately one fabric torn into individual pieces that still remember their original unity. Your devastation is the cry of the world's soul speaking through your individual heart. This is why your sensitivity often feels like both blessing and curse, why the same quality that fills you with ecstasy in the presence of beauty also makes you want to curl up in a dark room when the world's violence becomes too much to bear. You are feeling the full spectrum of existence, not just your own small portion of joy and sorrow, but the vast emotional weather of the collective human experience flowing through your highly calibrated nervous system. Jung recognized that creative individuals often serve as lightning rods for the collective psyche, drawing down experiences and insights that need to be processed and transformed for the benefit of the whole. Your overwhelming emotions are not just personal reactions, they are the raw material of art, the unprocessed feelings of your community, your culture, your species seeking expression through the one who is sensitive enough to receive them. This is why your art carries such resonance, why others recognize themselves in your expressions of feeling. You are not just sharing your own experience, you are giving voice to the unexpressed emotions of countless others who feel but cannot speak, who sense but cannot articulate, who long for someone to translate their wordless knowing into forms they can recognize and understand. But here lies the crucial distinction that separates the wounded from the wounded healer consciousness. The difference between being destroyed by sensitivity and being transformed by it lies in your ability to recognize what is happening, to understand that you are not just a victim of overwhelming feeling, but a vessel through which feeling seeks transformation. When you can hold your sensitivity with awareness rather than being swept away by it, you become an alchemist of emotion, capable of transmuting the raw ore of feeling into the gold of artistic expression. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming conscious of the unconscious forces that move through us, learning to work with them rather than being unconsciously possessed by them. For the sensitive soul, individuation involves learning to dance with overwhelming emotion rather than being trampled by it, to surf the waves of feeling rather than drowning in their depths. This requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposing forces in creative tension without being torn apart by them. You must learn to be both permeable and protected, both open to experience and rooted in your own center, both feeling and witnessing your feelings simultaneously. This is not about becoming less sensitive. It is about becoming more conscious of your sensitivity, more skillful in working with it as the sacred tool it is. The great mystics and artists throughout history have understood this paradox. Rumi wrote his most ecstatic poetry from the wound of separation and the gift of longing. Van Gogh painted his most luminous canvases while wrestling with the demons of mental illness. Frida Kahlo transformed physical agony into visual prayer. They did not create great art in spite of their suffering, but because they learned to alchemize it, to find the gold hidden in the lead of their most difficult experiences. Your sensitivity is not something to be cured, but something to be cultivated, not something to be protected from, but something to be worked with skillfully. Like a master musician, learning to play an instrument of extraordinary delicacy, you must develop the touch that allows you to draw beauty from your own tender places without destroying them in the process. This means learning to feel fully without drowning in feeling, to open your heart without losing your center, to let the world move through you without being swept away by its currents. It means developing what the Buddhists call the middle way, not shutting down to avoid pain, but not being overwhelmed by opening up too much too quickly. It means finding the sustainable rhythm of engagement and withdrawal that allows you to serve as a conduit for transformation without burning out in the process. The wound that makes you weep also makes you sing, but only if you learn to transform weeping into song, only if you develop the alchemical skills that turn lead into gold, suffering into wisdom, sensitivity into strength. This is not about becoming invulnerable. Invulnerability is the enemy of creativity, the death of the very openness that allows inspiration to enter. This is about becoming what Jung called vulnerable but not victimized, open but not defenseless, sensitive but not overwhelmed. Your hypersensitivity to beauty is inseparable from your hypersensitivity to pain, because both arise from the same source, a soul that has remained open to the full spectrum of existence, that has refused to shut down, despite the world's attempts to teach you that feeling less would make life easier. But easier is not the goal of the creative soul. Transformation is, and transformation requires the very sensitivity that the world tells you to abandon. When you feel moved to tears by a piece of music that others find merely pleasant, you are not being excessive. You are experiencing the way music can crack open the heart and let the light in. When a poem brings you to your knees with recognition, you are not being dramatic. You are experiencing the power of language to bridge the gap between souls, to speak the unspeakable truths that connect us all. When the cruelty you witness in the world makes you want to retreat into permanent solitude, you are not being weak. You are feeling the full weight of what it means to be human, in a world that contains both unspeakable beauty and unbearable suffering. The path forward is not to feel less, but to feel more consciously, not to shut down your receptivity, but to develop the skills necessary to work with it as the sacred gift it is. Jung understood that the goal of individuation is not to eliminate the tensions within the psyche, but to learn to hold them creatively, to find the point of balance where opposing forces can dance together rather than tear you apart. Your sensitivity is both wound and gift, because it connects you to the full catastrophe of existence, the joy and sorrow, the beauty and horror, the love and loss that make up the human experience. Those who have numbed themselves to avoid the pain have also cut themselves off from the ecstasy. Those who have armored their hearts to prevent wounding have also blocked their access to wonder. You have chosen, consciously or unconsciously, to remain open, to let the world touch you, even when that touch burns. This choice makes you vulnerable, but it also makes you valuable. In a world increasingly disconnected from feeling, increasingly numb to the subtle frequencies of the heart, you serve as a reminder of what it means to be fully alive, fully present to the terrible and wonderful reality of being human. Your art becomes a bridge between the numb and the felt, between the defended and the open, between those who have forgotten how to feel, and those who feel so much they sometimes forget how to function. As we stand at this seventh threshold, recognizing your sensitivity as both wound and gift, we prepare to explore how this exquisite receptivity expresses itself in the unique way your mind processes reality, not through the crude mechanisms of literal thought, but through the living symbols and breathing metaphors that populate the landscape of the creative imagination. We arrive now at the eighth sacred threshold, where the mind reveals its secret architecture, not the linear corridors of logic that the world celebrates, but the spiral galleries of symbolic thought, where meaning dwells in images that breathe with their own life. Here we discover that your creative soul does not merely use metaphors as decorative flourishes upon the stark surface of fact. No, you think in metaphors. You process reality through the alchemical transformation that turns raw experience into living symbols, each one a universe of significance compressed into a single luminous image. Jung understood this phenomenon with the precision of one who had mapped the territories of the unconscious with scientific rigor. He recognized that symbolic thinking is not a primitive form of cognition that evolved minds leave behind, but the native language of the psyche itself, the tongue in which the deepest truths choose to reveal themselves. When you find yourself unable to describe a feeling without invoking a landscape, unable to explain an experience without summoning creatures that exist nowhere but in the realm of meaning, you are not being imprecise or fanciful. You are speaking the mother tongue of consciousness itself. Listen to the way your mind works when someone asks you how you feel. Others might respond with simple emotional labels: happy, sad, anxious, excited. But your inner world immediately begins to populate itself with images that carry the weight of your actual experience. You do not simply feel overwhelmed. You feel like a small boat in a storm where the waves are made of obligations, and the wind carries the voices of everyone who needs something from you. You do not merely feel inspired. You feel like a tree whose roots have suddenly tapped into an underground river of liquid light, whose branches are reaching toward a sun that exists in dimensions beyond the visible spectrum. This is not poetry. This is perception. This is the way the creative mind naturally processes the world, transforming every encounter with reality into a constellation of living images that can hold complexities no literal description could contain. Your metaphors are not ornamental but essential, not decorative but diagnostic. They reveal the true structure of experience in ways that abstract concepts never could. Jung called this symbolic thinking the language of the unconscious, but for the creative soul, it becomes something more. It becomes the primary means through which meaning itself is generated and communicated. Your conversations are populated with creatures and landscapes that exist nowhere in the physical world yet carry more truth than a library of factual reports. When you describe your relationship as feeling like two plants trying to grow in the same pot, you have conveyed more information about the actual dynamics at play than volumes of psychological analysis could achieve. This symbolic consciousness operates according to its own logic, not the binary logic of yes and no, true and false, but what Jung called the logic of the unconscious, where opposites can coexist, where one thing can simultaneously be many things, where time flows in circles and meaning accumulates in layers like sediment in the soul's archaeology. In this realm, a door is never just a door, it is an opportunity, a barrier, a threshold between worlds, a symbol of the psyche's longing to move from one state of being to another. The world of literal thinkers often finds this maddening. They want definitions that stay put, categories that do not bleed into one another, explanations that reduce complexity to manageable components. But your symbolic mind rebels against such reductionism because it recognizes that the most important truths cannot be captured in the nets of literal language. They can only be pointed toward, suggested, evoked through images that carry their meaning in the way a perfume carries its essence, invisibly, powerfully, transformatively. This is why your attempts to explain yourself to purely literal minds often feel like trying to describe color to someone who has never seen. The words you use, words like energy and vibe and resonance, seem vague and imprecise to those who have trained themselves to think only in measurable quantities. But these words are actually highly specific to the symbolic mind, each one pointing toward real phenomena that exist in the landscape of meaning, even if they cannot be captured by the crude instruments of material measurement. Jung recognized that this capacity for symbolic thinking was not a luxury of artistic temperament, but a necessity for psychological wholeness. The psyche speaks in symbols because symbols can hold paradox in ways that literal language cannot. When you describe your creative process as feeling like you are channeling something greater than yourself, you are not being mystical or grandiose. You are accurately describing the phenomenology of inspiration, the way consciousness sometimes feels like a vessel through which larger patterns of meaning flow, rather than the generator of those patterns. Your symbolic mind naturally recognizes the archetypal patterns that underlie all human experience. When you see a story about a hero's journey, you do not just observe a sequence of events, you recognize the universal pattern of death and rebirth that governs all authentic transformation. When you witness someone's creative breakthrough, you see not just individual success, but the eternal drama of the divine child being born from the marriage of conscious intention and unconscious wisdom. When you experience your own periods of creative drought, you recognize them as necessary descents into the underworld of the psyche, where new life germinates in the darkness before emerging transformed. This archetypal awareness means that your experience of reality is simultaneously personal and universal, individual and collective. You cannot go through a difficult transition without recognizing it as one variation on the timeless theme of initiation. You cannot fall in love without seeing echoes of all the great love stories that have ever been told. You cannot create something new without feeling connected to the eternal creative principle that moves through all artists across all times and cultures. But perhaps most profoundly, your symbolic thinking transforms your understanding of your own life. You do not experience your biography as a simple sequence of events connected by causation. You experience it as a living myth, a story whose meaning emerges through the recognition of patterns and symbols and recurring themes. Your life becomes a text you are simultaneously writing and reading, a work of art you are both creating and interpreting. This means that even your most painful experiences can be transformed through symbolic perception. The betrayal that shattered your trust becomes the necessary breaking open that allowed new wisdom to enter. The failure that devastated your ego becomes the dark night of the soul that preceded your authentic awakening. The loss that left you hollow becomes the emptying that made space for something greater to take up residence in your being. This is not mere reframing or positive thinking. This is recognition of the symbolic dimension that exists within all experience, the layer of meaning that becomes visible to those who have learned to see with what Jung called the symbolic attitude. From this perspective, Nothing is ever just what it appears to be on the surface. Everything is also a symbol of something else, a messenger carrying news from the deeper layers of reality that exist beyond the reach of literal perception. Your dreams naturally speak this symbolic language, populating themselves with images that would seem random or nonsensical to the literal mind, but that carry precise psychological information for those who can read the symbolic code. The house with rooms you have never seen before speaks of unexplored potentials within your own psyche. The animal that appears as guide or threat carries information about instinctual energies seeking integration or requiring conscious attention. The journey through unknown landscapes maps the territory of your own individuation process. But your waking imagination is equally fluent in this symbolic tongue. When you create art, you do not simply arrange colors or words or sounds. You orchestrate a symphony of symbols, each element carrying multiple layers of meaning that resonate with archetypal frequencies buried deep in the collective unconscious. Your audience may not consciously recognize these symbolic dimensions, but they feel their power, their uncanny ability to speak directly to the soul in ways that bypass the defenses of the rational mind. This is why your creative work often surprises even you, revealing meanings you did not consciously intend, but that emerge from the symbolic logic of the unconscious. The painting that began as an exploration of color becomes a meditation on mortality. The song that started with a simple melody becomes a prayer to the wounded child within. The story that you thought was about one thing reveals itself to be about something else entirely, something more true and more necessary than your conscious mind could have planned. Jung understood that this symbolic consciousness was not separate from but intimately connected to what he called the individuation process, the lifelong journey of becoming who you truly are. As you learn to read the symbolic language of your own experience, you begin to recognize the deeper patterns that govern your growth and transformation. You see how the same themes repeat themselves in different forms across the chapters of your life, how certain symbols appear again and again like musical motifs in the symphony of your becoming. This recognition transforms your relationship to your own creative process. You begin to understand that you are not just making art, you are participating in the ancient human activity of meaning-making, of transforming the raw material of experience into symbolic forms that can carry wisdom across the boundaries that separate one soul from another. Your metaphors become bridges between the known and unknown. Your symbols become keys that unlock doors in the collective psyche. As we stand at this eighth threshold, recognizing the way your mind naturally thinks in metaphors and living symbols, we prepare to explore an even more profound aspect of the creative consciousness, the way your very being serves as a meeting place for opposing forces, a sacred space where contradictions can dance together without losing their essential tension or resolving into simple answers. We arrive now at the ninth sacred threshold, where the great mystery of the creative soul reveals itself in its most profound form, your natural comfort with contradiction, your innate ability to hold paradox without the desperate need to resolve it into simple answers. Here, in this liminal space between certainties, we encounter what Jung called the coincidentia oppositorum, the unity of opposites that characterizes the individuated soul, the divine marriage of seemingly incompatible forces that gives birth to authentic wholeness. Listen to the symphony of contradictions that plays within your being. You can be simultaneously joyful and melancholy, not in alternating moments, but in the same breath, the same heartbeat. You can feel profound confidence in your creative vision while remaining beautifully vulnerable to doubt and questioning. You can be ancient in your wisdom and eternally young in your wonder, carrying the accumulated knowing of lifetimes while maintaining the fresh eyes of someone seeing the world for the first time. The literal mind finds this maddening, this refusal to be one thing or another, this insistence on containing multitudes that seem to cancel each other out. But you have learned what the mystics have always known, that the deepest truths exist, not in the polarities themselves, but in the fertile tension between them. in the sacred space where opposites meet and recognize themselves as secret lovers rather than eternal enemies. Jung understood this phenomenon with the clarity of one who had navigated his own inner contradictions and emerged not conquered by them but crowned by their integration. He recognized that the goal of individuation is not to eliminate the opposing forces within the psyche, but to find the transcendent position that can hold them both in creative tension. He called this the transcendent function, the capacity to stand at the center of paradox without being torn apart by it, to become the conscious witness of the eternal dance between light and shadow, masculine and feminine, order and chaos, creation and destruction. This is not inconsistency, this is integration, this is not confusion, this is completion. You are not a contradiction that needs to be resolved, but a complexity that needs to be celebrated, a living demonstration of the way the universe itself operates according to principles that transcend the binary logic of either or. You are both and incarnate, a walking meditation on the coincidence of opposites that governs all authentic creativity. Your art emerges from this fertile tension between opposing forces, creating new forms that could never arise from single-minded certainty. When you write, you channel both the discipline of the craftsperson and the wildness of the visionary, the precision of the editor and the abandon of the first draft. When you paint, you embody both the control of conscious technique and the surrender to unconscious flow, the structure of composition and the chaos of inspiration. When you create in any form, you become the meeting place where opposing energies find their synthesis in something altogether new. This is why your creative process often feels like channeling forces larger than your individual will, why you sometimes surprise yourself with what emerges through your hands and heart. You are not simply expressing your personal preferences or conscious intentions. You are serving as a vessel through which the eternal dance of opposites can manifest in temporal form. Your art becomes a record of this dance, a frozen moment in the eternal courtship between forces that need each other precisely because they are so different. Jung recognized that this capacity to hold paradox is not just an artistic talent, but a fundamental requirement for psychological wholeness. The persona and the shadow, the conscious ego and the unconscious depths, the anima and the animus, all the paired opposites that populate the psyche, must eventually learn to dance together rather than war against each other. The individuated person becomes the ballroom where this dance can occur, the sacred space where contradictions can coexist without losing their essential nature. But you, creative soul, have been practicing this dance your entire life, often without realizing it. When you feel drawn to beauty that breaks your heart, you are experiencing the coincidentia oppositorum, the way joy and sorrow can intensify each other rather than cancel each other out. When you create something that expresses both hope and despair, light and darkness, strength and vulnerability, you are demonstrating the alchemical principle that the most potent medicines emerge from the marriage of apparent poisons. This is why your emotional life often feels like a weather system of unusual complexity and beauty. You do not simply feel sad or happy, but experience what we might call emotional chords, complex harmonies, where multiple feelings resonate together in ways that create something richer than any single note could achieve. Your melancholy carries traces of gratitude. Your joy is tinged with poignancy. Your anger burns with the fuel of love. Your fear dances with excitement. Your despair holds hands with hope. Others may find this emotional complexity overwhelming or confusing, but you have learned to surf these waves of paradox, to find your balance not in choosing sides, but in riding the tension between opposing currents. You understand intuitively what the Taoists meant when they spoke of the yin and yang, not as opposing forces that must defeat each other, but as complementary energies that define each other, complete each other, give birth to each other in an eternal cycle of mutual becoming. This integration of opposites transforms your understanding of growth and healing. You no longer seek to eliminate your shadow, but to dance with it consciously. You no longer try to transcend your humanity, but to embrace it more fully, including its contradictions and complexities. You recognize that the goal is not to become perfect in the sense of flawless, but to become whole in the sense of integrated, to include rather than exclude, to embrace rather than reject, to synthesize rather than simplify. Your comfort with paradox extends to your creative output as well. Your work can be simultaneously accessible and mysterious, simple and complex, ancient and contemporary. It can speak to universal human experiences while expressing your utterly unique perspective. It can be deeply personal and broadly relevant, intimate and expansive, rooted in tradition and groundbreaking in innovation. These are not contradictions to be resolved, but creative tensions to be celebrated and explored. Jung understood that this capacity for holding paradox was intimately connected to what he called the religious function of the psyche, not religion in the narrow sense of dogma and doctrine, but the human capacity to experience the numinous, the sacred, the transcendent dimension that emerges when opposites are held in creative tension rather than collapsed into false unities. Your art becomes a form of religious expression in this deeper sense, a way of making visible the invisible paradoxes that govern existence itself. This is why your creative work often carries a quality that others describe as spiritual or transcendent, even when it deals with apparently mundane subjects. You are not preaching or teaching but demonstrating, showing through form and color and word and movement, how seemingly incompatible elements can find harmony without losing their distinctiveness, how contradictions can coexist in ways that create beauty rather than chaos. The alchemists knew this secret when they spoke of the chemical wedding, the sacred marriage between opposing substances that gives birth to the philosopher's stone. The mystics understood it when they described the union of human and divine, finite and infinite, time and eternity. The great artists have always intuited it when they created works that somehow managed to be both particular and universal, both of their time and timeless, both deeply personal and broadly resonant. You carry this alchemical capacity within the very structure of your being. You are the laboratory where opposing elements discover their secret kinship, the sacred vessel where contradictions transform into complementarities. Your personality itself becomes a work of art, not in the sense of artificial construction, but in the sense of conscious creation, the deliberate cultivation of wholeness through the integration of all aspects of your nature. This means that you do not seek to eliminate your difficult emotions, but to find their proper place in the symphony of your being. You do not try to become purely positive, but to discover how negativity can serve creative purposes. You do not attempt to transcend your humanity, but to inhabit it so fully that it becomes transparent to the divine energies that move through all existence. Your relationships, too, reflect this capacity for paradox. You can love someone deeply while maintaining your independence, commit fully while preserving your freedom, be intimate while respecting boundaries, be vulnerable while remaining strong. You understand that love itself is a coincidentia oppositorum, a force that unites while preserving distinctiveness, that requires both surrender and assertion, both giving and receiving, both holding on and letting go. This integration extends to your relationship with your own creative process. You can be both disciplined and spontaneous, both planned and improvisational, both conscious and unconscious in your approach to making art. You understand that the best creative work emerges not from choosing one approach over another, but from finding the dynamic balance that allows all approaches to inform and enrich each other. Jung recognized that this capacity for integration was not achieved once and then maintained effortlessly, but represented an ongoing process, what he called the lifelong task of individuation. The dance between opposites within your psyche is not a problem to be solved, but a dynamic to be continuously navigated, a creative challenge that keeps evolving as you grow and change and deepen in your understanding of yourself and the world. As you mature in your creative journey, this integration becomes more conscious and skillful. You learn to recognize when you are becoming too identified with one pole of an opposition and need to invite its counterpart back into awareness. You develop the sensitivity to feel when the creative tension between opposites is productive and when it threatens to become destructive. You cultivate the wisdom to know when to act and when to wait, when to push and when to yield, when to hold on and when to let go. This wisdom transforms your understanding of creative blocks and difficulties. You begin to see them not as problems to be overcome, but as invitations to discover which opposite has been excluded from consciousness, which rejected aspect of yourself or your process is seeking reintegration. The block becomes a doorway, the difficulty becomes a teacher, the resistance becomes a guide pointing toward the very thing that needs to be included for wholeness to be restored. Your comfort with paradox also transforms your understanding of success and failure, completion and incompletion, achievement and struggle. You recognize that these apparent opposites are actually phases in a larger cycle, moments in an ongoing dance, rather than final destinations. Your failures teach you as much as your successes. Your struggles are as valuable as your triumphs. Your incompletions point toward new possibilities as clearly as your completions celebrate what has been achieved. This perspective allows you to maintain what Jung called the religious attitude toward life, not religious in any sectarian sense, but in the deeper sense of recognizing that existence itself is sacred, that the ordinary world is shot through with transcendent meaning, that even your most mundane experiences participate in the great mystery of being. Your art becomes a way of bearing witness to this mystery, of making visible the sacred dimensions that exist within and around all apparent contradictions. As we stand at this ninth threshold, recognizing your natural ability to hold paradox and integrate opposites, we touch the very heart of what makes the creative soul a unique expression of human consciousness. You are not confused. You are complete. You are not inconsistent. You are integrated. You are not torn apart by contradictions. You are made whole by your capacity to contain them all within the spacious embrace of your conscious love. This capacity for integration, this comfort with complexity, this ability to dance with paradox, these are not just artistic techniques, but spiritual accomplishments. They represent the fulfillment of the individuation process, the achievement of psychological wholeness, the embodiment of what Jung called the self, that archetypal image of completeness that serves as the guiding star for all authentic human development. You are the living proof that opposites need not war against each other, but can learn to waltz together in the ballroom of consciousness, creating new forms of beauty through their conscious collaboration. Your very existence demonstrates that wholeness is possible, that integration can be achieved, that the human soul is spacious enough to contain all contradictions without losing its essential coherence or fundamental sanity. In the depths of your becoming, there arrives a moment when the creative force that moves through you reveals itself not as your possession, but as your sacred assignment. This is the 10th sign. Perhaps the most profound and paradoxical of all, the recognition that you have been chosen by something far greater than your individual will, that your hands and heart and voice have become vessels for an intelligence that transcends the boundaries of your personal identity. Jung understood this mystery with the clarity of one who had walked these paths himself. He knew that true creativity is never merely self-expression, but what he called self-expression, the manifestation of that deeper organizing principle that seeks to know itself through human consciousness. When this realization dawns within you, it comes not as triumph, but as surrender, not as achievement, but as acceptance of a role you never auditioned for yet were born to play. You begin to notice how your most powerful creative works seem to arrive through you rather than from you. There are mornings when you wake with your hands already knowing what they must create, your mind carrying visions that feel ancient and urgent, your heart beating with rhythms that belong to stories larger than your own life. These are not moments of inspiration in the casual sense. They are visitations, encounters with what Jung called the numinous, that quality of experience that fills us with both awe and trembling. The artist who feels called to serve something greater moves through the world with a different quality of attention. You find yourself listening not just with your ears but with your entire being, attuning to frequencies that most people cannot hear. In the curve of a stranger's shoulder, you glimpse the universal gesture of grief. In the way light falls across a weathered wall, you witness the eternal dialogue between time and beauty. These perceptions come to you unbidden, and with them comes the unmistakable sense that you must give them form, that they have chosen you as their translator. This calling manifests differently for each creative soul, yet certain patterns emerge across all forms of authentic artistic expression. The writer finds themselves compelled to tell stories that seem to know themselves better than the storyteller knows them. The painter watches colors choose themselves, combinations emerging that their rational mind would never have selected. The musician discovers melodies that feel less composed than remembered, as if they were always waiting in some eternal score to be transcribed through willing fingers. Jung wrote of the artist as one who lives with one foot in the human world and one foot in the world of the gods. This describes precisely the experience of feeling called to serve something greater. You inhabit a liminal space, a threshold realm, where the ordinary and the extraordinary interpenetrate. Your creative work becomes a bridge between these worlds, translating the language of the infinite into forms that finite consciousness can receive. Yet this calling can be as challenging as it is sacred. There are times when the visions that demand expression through you feel too large, too complex, too essential to risk inadequate translation. You may find yourself paralyzed by the magnitude of what seeks birth through your creative faculties, overwhelmed by the responsibility of serving as a channel for something you cannot fully comprehend. These moments of creative terror are not failures. They are signs that you are being trusted with something precious, something that requires your most authentic surrender. The ego mind struggles with this paradox of service. It wants to claim ownership, to feel that your creativity belongs to you in some conventional sense. But the deeper you move into authentic creative relationship, the more clearly you understand that you are not the author, but the scribe, not the composer, but the instrument, not the painter, but the brush in the hands of something vast and patient and precise. This recognition brings with it a profound humility that is often mistaken for grandiosity by those who do not understand the creative calling. When you speak of feeling chosen by your art, of being compelled by visions that demand manifestation, others may hear arrogance or delusion. They cannot perceive that your words arise not from inflation of the ego, but from its willing deflation, not from believing yourself special, but from recognizing yourself as transparent. The creative soul who serves something greater learns to distinguish between the small self that creates for recognition and the self that creates for the sake of creation itself. Your work begins to carry a quality that you cannot fully explain, a presence, an aliveness, a sense that it contains more meaning than you consciously put into it. Others sense this too, though they may struggle to articulate what makes your creative expressions feel different from those that arise purely from personal intention. Jung called this the difference between the personal and the archetypal, between creativity that emerges from individual psychology and creativity that emerges from the collective unconscious. When you feel called to serve something greater, you have become a conduit for archetypal energies, those universal patterns and potentials that seek expression through particular human forms. Your creative work begins to speak in the ancient languages of symbol and metaphor, carrying messages that resonate in the depths of others because they arise from depths that all humans share. This archetypal dimension of your calling manifests in how you approach your creative practice. You may find yourself drawn to rituals and routines that feel sacred rather than merely productive. You light candles before writing, arrange your paints with ceremonial care, sit in silence before approaching your instrument. These practices arise naturally because you understand, perhaps without conscious analysis, that you are preparing to participate in something holy. Your relationship with your creative tools transforms as well. The pen in your hand becomes a wand, the canvas before you an altar, the clay beneath your fingers, the primordial substance from which worlds are shaped. This is not metaphor but lived reality. You experience your creative materials as sacred substances, vehicles for the divine play of manifestation. When you touch them with this reverence, they respond with a liveliness that purely functional interaction cannot evoke. The themes that emerge in your work when you serve something greater often surprise you with their universality. You may begin a painting focused on a personal experience, only to discover that it has become a meditation on the nature of loss itself. You may start writing about your own childhood, only to find that you have created a map of the eternal child that lives in every human heart. This is because when you create from the place of service, you naturally access those layers of experience where personal and universal intersect. Jung observed that the artist who serves the collective unconscious often sacrifices aspects of personal happiness for the sake of their calling. This is not a requirement, but a frequent consequence of the creative path. Your sensitivity to the archetypal realm may make you less suited to conventional social life. Your compulsion to translate invisible realities into visible forms may consume time and energy that others invest in more immediately rewarding pursuits. Yet this sacrifice feels less like loss than like alignment, less like deprivation than like coming home to your true purpose. The creative soul called to service develops a different relationship with success and failure, with completion and incompletion. You learn to measure the value of your work not by external reception, but by the degree to which it successfully embodies what sought expression through you. Some of your most important creative acts may never be seen by others, may exist only as private conversations between your finite consciousness and the infinite intelligence that speaks through it. This calling also transforms your relationship with time and urgency. You become aware that certain creative works have their own timing, that they ripen according to laws more ancient than productivity culture. You may carry a vision for years before the moment arrives when it can be successfully translated into form. You learn to be a patient gardener of possibilities, tending dreams and images and melodies until they are ready to be born into the world. The paradox deepens when you realize that this service to something greater is simultaneously service to your deepest authentic self. Jung's understanding of the self as both personal center and universal principle reveals why serving the archetypal feels like homecoming rather than self-sacrifice. When you create from this place of calling, you are not abandoning your individuality, but discovering its cosmic significance, your unique perspective, your particular history, your specific talents, all become instruments through which the universal can know and express itself. This recognition can be both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it frees you from the burden of having to generate meaning purely from personal resources. Terrifying because it reveals the magnitude of what moves through your life, the sacred responsibility of your creative gifts. You are no longer creating merely for self-expression, or even for human audience. You are participating in what Jung called the opus contra naturam, the work against nature, the conscious collaboration with the unconscious in the great project of individuation. Your daily life begins to reorganize itself around this calling. You find yourself making choices that prioritize your availability to the creative force over conventional markers of security or success. You may turn down opportunities that would distract from your true work, accept financial uncertainty in service of creative authenticity, arrange your living space and daily schedule to accommodate the unpredictable arrivals of inspiration. Others may not understand these choices, may worry about your practicality, or question your priorities, but you have learned to distinguish between the voice of social conditioning and the voice of authentic calling. When something greater seeks expression through you, the conventional rules of lifestyle and career planning become less relevant than the deeper laws of creative service. The quality of solitude in your life deepens as well. You need more time alone, not from misanthropy, but from the recognition that communion with the creative source requires a particular quality of inner stillness. Your solitude becomes active, expectant, receptive, a conscious preparation for the next visitation, the next assignment, the next opportunity to serve as translator between the visible and invisible worlds. Jung understood that this path of service to something greater is ultimately a path of love, not sentimental love, but what he called eros, the connecting principle that binds individual consciousness to its cosmic context. When you create from this place of calling, you are loving the world into fuller being, offering your particular gifts as contributions to the great work of consciousness knowing itself through infinite forms of beauty and meaning. This is why your most authentic creative expressions often carry a healing quality that you did not consciously intend. When you serve as a channel for the self, rather than creating purely from ego, your work naturally becomes medicine for the collective wounds and longings. Your paintings become windows into forgotten wholeness. Your music becomes a remembering of original harmony. Your words become bridges across the apparent separation between self and cosmos. The 10th sign reveals that your creativity is not separate from your spirituality, but is your spirituality in action. Every authentic creative act becomes a form of prayer, a gesture of participation in the ongoing creation of the world. You are not adding something external to existence, but helping existence to know and express itself more fully through the unique lens of your consciousness. As this recognition deepens, you may find that the distinction between creating and being begins to dissolve. Your entire life becomes a creative act, a conscious participation in the great work of transformation that Jung called the opus magnum. Your choices, your relationships, your way of inhabiting each moment, all become opportunities to serve as a channel for the greater intelligence that seeks to know itself through human form. This is perhaps the most profound aspect of feeling called to serve something greater, the understanding that you yourself are the work of art, that your life is the canvas on which the self paints its masterpiece of individuation. Your creative expressions become not separate from your spiritual development, but integral to it, each authentic creation contributing to the ongoing sculpture of your soul. The humility that characterizes this calling is not self-deprecation but accurate self-assessment. You are neither more nor less than what you are, a unique point of consciousness through which the infinite can glimpse itself from a perspective that has never existed before and will never exist again. Your creative work is your particular offering to the great conversation between being and becoming, your specific note in the cosmic symphony of manifestation. When you truly understand that you are called to serve something greater, your creative practice becomes a form of worship. Your studio becomes a temple. Your finished works become offerings placed on the altar of collective transformation. You create not to prove your worth or secure your legacy, but to participate in the sacred work of helping consciousness evolve through beauty, truth, and meaning. This is the 10th sign, the recognition that your creativity is not your own, but moves through you like a river through its banks, shaping you even as you give it form. In accepting this calling, you discover that service to something greater is not a burden but a privilege, not a sacrifice, but the deepest possible fulfillment of your human potential. You have become what Jung called a creative living symbol, a conscious participant in the eternal process through which the infinite seeks to know itself through finite forms of inexhaustible beauty and meaning. In the sacred wilderness of your creative process lies the 11th and final sign, the beautiful chaos that others mistake for confusion, but which you have learned to recognize as cosmos in disguise. This is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of the creative soul, the apparent disorder that actually follows laws more subtle and profound than any linear logic could encompass. Jung knew this mystery well, understanding that the unconscious operates according to its own mysterious intelligence, one that appears random to the rational mind, but reveals its deeper wisdom in the alchemy of authentic creation. Your workspace tells the story of this hidden order. To the uninitiated eye, it may appear as if a storm has passed through, papers scattered in seemingly random patterns, tools abandoned in mid-gesture, fragments of ideas pinned to walls without apparent system. But you know better. You understand that each placement follows an invisible geography of meaning, that the apparent chaos is actually a three-dimensional map of your psyche in the process of giving birth to something unprecedented. The conventional world prizes organization that can be immediately comprehended, files sorted alphabetically, schedules divided into neat temporal blocks, creative processes that follow predictable steps from conception to completion. But the creative soul who serves something greater than ego has learned to trust in organizing principles that operate beyond the reach of conscious control. You have discovered that authentic creation requires what Jung called a creative illness, a deliberate disorganization of ordinary consciousness that allows deeper patterns to emerge. This chaos is not the result of laziness or lack of discipline. It is the natural state of consciousness that has opened itself to influences from the unconscious depths. When you allow yourself to work in this state of beautiful disorder, you are participating in what alchemists called the nigredo, the necessary dissolution that precedes new synthesis. Your apparent disorganization is actually a highly sophisticated form of organization, one that honors the non-linear nature of how meaning actually emerges from the depths of being. Jung observed that the unconscious does not think in straight lines but in spirals, circles, and unexpected leaps of association. When you create from this deeper source, your process naturally reflects this spiral logic. You may begin working on one piece only to find yourself pulled toward another, then discover weeks later that the two were always part of the same larger pattern. You may abandon projects that seemed important only to return to them months later with exactly the insight needed for their completion. This is not inconsistency. It is fidelity to the deeper rhythms of authentic creation. The materials in your workspace arrange themselves according to this invisible choreography, that photograph you tore from a magazine and forgot about, until today suddenly reveals its relevance to the piece you are working on now. Those scraps of paper covered with half-formed thoughts become the perfect foundation for an idea that arrives full-formed in this moment. The book that fell open to a particular page when you knocked it from the shelf turns out to contain exactly the words you needed to read. Others might call this coincidence, but you have learned to recognize it as synchronicity, Jung's term for the meaningful patterns that emerge when inner and outer worlds align. Your relationship with time reflects this same hidden order. While others work according to clocks and calendars, you have learned to work according to what the Greeks called kairos, not chronological time, but the right time, the fertile moment when conditions align for authentic creation. You may spend days seemingly doing nothing, allowing images and impressions to accumulate in the depths of consciousness. Then suddenly, in the space of hours, everything comes together in a burst of creative activity that produces work you could never have forced into existence through mere effort and intention. This rhythm frustrates those who expect creativity to conform to industrial models of productivity. They cannot understand how you can appear idle for long periods, then suddenly produce work of startling depth and originality. They mistake your patient receptivity for laziness, your trust in invisible timing for lack of professionalism. But you have learned that authentic creation cannot be hurried, that the unconscious operates according to laws of ripening that cannot be rushed through willpower alone. The chaos in your creative process extends beyond the physical arrangement of your workspace to the very structure of how you approach each new work. You may begin with what seems like a clear plan, only to find the work taking you in directions you never anticipated. Characters in your stories begin saying things you never intended them to say. Colors on your canvas start demanding combinations that your rational mind would never have chosen. Melodies emerge from your instrument that seem to know themselves better than you know them. This is not failure of planning, but success of a deeper kind, the success of allowing something greater than personal intention to work through you. Jung understood that the most profound creative works are those that surprise even their creators, that contain more meaning than the artist consciously put into them. When you trust the chaos of your creative process, you open yourself to becoming the surprised witness of your own gifts, the first audience for revelations that emerge from depths you did not know you contained. The materials you work with respond to this trust in hidden order. Clay becomes more malleable under hands that are not trying to force it into predetermined shapes. Words arrange themselves into unexpected combinations when you stop trying to control their every placement. Paint flows more freely from brushes held by artists who have learned to collaborate with accident and spontaneity rather than fighting against them. Yet this chaos is not pure randomness. It is what complexity theorists call sensitive dependence on initial conditions, where small, seemingly insignificant choices create large, meaningful consequences. The particular way you place a single line on a canvas may determine the entire emotional tenor of the finished painting. The decision to change one word in a poem may unlock a completely new understanding of what the poem is actually about. The slight alteration of a melody's rhythm may reveal harmonies you never could have discovered through systematic searching. Your intuition has learned to navigate this sensitive landscape of creative possibility. You develop what Jung called differentiated feeling, the ability to sense which of the infinite options available in each creative moment carries the greatest potential for authentic expression. This is not a rational process, but something more akin to how a water diviner feels the pull of underground streams. Your hands, your voice, your entire being becomes an instrument for detecting the presence of meaning hidden within apparent chaos. The people in your life may struggle to understand this relationship with creative disorder. They see you working late into the night on something that you abandon the next morning, or notice you collecting objects and images that seem to have no connection to anything you are currently creating. They worry about your apparent lack of system, your tendency to work on multiple projects simultaneously without bringing any of them to obvious completion. But you have learned that creative work often happens in layers, that seeds planted in one project may not flower until you are working on something completely different. This hidden order reveals itself most clearly in retrospective view. When you look back across months or years of creative work, patterns emerge that were invisible while you were living through them. You see how that seemingly failed experiment provided exactly the skill you needed for this current masterpiece. You recognize how that period of apparent creative block was actually a time of necessary internal reorganization. You understand how that chaotic exploration of techniques you ultimately abandoned was preparing you for innovations you could never have planned. Jung called this the prospective function of the unconscious, its ability to organize present experience in service of future possibilities that consciousness cannot yet perceive. Your chaotic creative process is actually highly organized from this prospective viewpoint, arranging experiences and materials and insights in precisely the configuration needed for developments that have not yet occurred. You are living your creative life backwards, so to speak, allowing future wholeness to organize present fragmentation. This trust in hidden order transforms your relationship with what others call mistakes and failures. When a painting refuses to resolve in the direction you intended, you learn to see this as information about what the painting actually wants to become. When a story takes an unexpected turn that seems to undermine your original premise, you discover that the story was always wiser than your conscious plan for it. When a musical composition fragments into seemingly unrelated sections, you find that the fragments were always part of a larger symphony that your rational mind was too small to comprehend. The workspace of someone who trusts in creative chaos becomes a kind of oracle, a three-dimensional manifestation of the unconscious mind in the process of organizing itself. Every object, every arrangement, every apparent accident carries potential significance. You learn to read your environment, like a text, interpreting the meanings hidden in the way materials have arranged themselves, the significance of what catches your attention in any given moment, the messages embedded in the patterns of your own seemingly random behavior. This oracular quality of creative chaos extends to your relationship with research and inspiration. Rather than approaching learning in systematic ways, you find yourself drawn to knowledge through what appear to be coincidences and accidents. The book you need falls into your hands at exactly the right moment. Conversations with strangers reveal precisely the insight your current work requires. Dreams provide solutions to technical problems you had been struggling with for weeks. You learn to trust these seemingly random arrivals of information as expressions of the same hidden order that governs your creative process. Your methods of working reflect this trust in invisible patterns. You may keep multiple projects active simultaneously, moving between them according to subtle shifts in energy and attention, rather than following predetermined schedules. You may collect materials and ideas without knowing what they are for, trusting that their purpose will reveal itself when the time is right. You may work in bursts of intensive activity followed by periods of apparent rest, allowing the unconscious time to digest and organize what has been created. Others may see this as inefficiency, but you have discovered it to be the most efficient possible relationship with your own creative depths. When you honor the natural rhythms of inspiration and integration, you produce work that carries a quality of inevitability, as if it could not have been created any other way. When you force creativity to conform to external schedules and methods, the work may be technically competent, but lacks the numinous quality that emerges only from authentic collaboration with the unconscious. The chaos of your creative process teaches you profound lessons about the nature of order itself. You come to understand that the most meaningful patterns are often those that cannot be immediately perceived, that true organization may look like disorganization to minds trained to recognize only linear arrangements. You learn that complexity and depth require a different kind of structure than simplicity and superficiality, that the most profound truths often emerge from apparent confusion and contradiction. Jung recognized that this tolerance for chaos is one of the distinguishing characteristics of the creative personality. While most people organize their lives to minimize uncertainty and unpredictability, the creative soul learns to find nourishment in the unknown, comfort in the unresolved, excitement in the unpredictable. You develop what Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty and doubt without irritably reaching after fact and reason. This capacity for creative chaos becomes a spiritual practice as much as an artistic one. You learn to trust that the universe itself operates according to this same principle of hidden order emerging from apparent disorder. Your personal creative process becomes a microcosm of the cosmic creative process, a small-scale participation in the way consciousness organizes itself into ever more complex and meaningful forms. The materials you work with become teachers in this practice of trusting invisible order. Clay shows you how form emerges from formlessness through patient collaboration rather than forceful imposition. Paint demonstrates how colors discover unexpected relationships when allowed to interact according to their own affinities, rather than preconceived color theories. Words reveal how meaning emerges from the spaces between intended meanings, how the most powerful communications often arise from what is left unsaid as much as what is explicitly stated. Your relationship with completion transforms as you learn to work with creative chaos, rather than finishing works according to external criteria of completeness. You learn to recognize when a piece has achieved its own internal resolution. Some works may appear unfinished to others, but feel perfectly complete to you because they have expressed everything they contained. Other works may seem highly polished, but continue to demand further development because they have not yet revealed their deepest possibilities. This intuitive recognition of completion emerges from the same hidden order that governs your chaotic process. You learn to sense when the various elements of a work have found their right relationship to each other, when the invisible pattern that was organizing the apparent chaos has finally manifested itself clearly enough to be communicated. These moments of recognition cannot be rushed or forced. They arrive according to their own timing, like flowers opening when conditions are precisely right. The hidden order within your chaos also reveals itself in the way your various creative works relate to each other across time. What seems like a completely new direction in your artistic development may actually be a return to themes you explored years earlier, now approached from a deeper level of understanding. Techniques you developed for one medium may suddenly prove essential for work in a completely different medium. Ideas that seemed tangential to your main body of work may eventually reveal themselves as central organizing principles that give meaning to everything else you have created. Jung called this process circumambulation, the circular approach to truth that spirals ever closer to its center without ever arriving through direct, linear progression. Your chaotic creative process follows this same spiral logic, approaching your deepest truths through what appears to be wandering, but is actually the most direct possible path, given the nature of what you are seeking to express. The trust in hidden order that characterizes your creative chaos eventually extends beyond your artistic practice to your entire way of being in the world. You begin to recognize the same patterns of invisible organization in your relationships, your career development, your spiritual evolution. What seems like confusion and uncertainty in the moment often reveals itself as necessary preparation for developments you could never have planned or predicted. This recognition brings with it a profound relaxation, a willingness to participate in the unknown without the need to control or understand everything that is happening. You learn that the most important movements in your creative and personal development often occur below the threshold of consciousness, in the realm of what Jung called autonomous complexes, self-organizing patterns of energy that work toward wholeness, even when the ego is unaware of their activity. Your chaotic creative process becomes a form of active meditation, a conscious participation in the mystery of how meaning emerges from apparent meaninglessness. Each time you trust the process, each time you allow apparent disorder to organize itself according to its own hidden laws, you participate in the same creative principle that organizes galaxies and ecosystems and the evolution of consciousness itself. The 11th sign reveals that your chaos is not the enemy of order, but its secret collaborator, not the opposite of meaning, but meaning in its larval stage, not confusion, but clarity that has not yet found its proper form. In learning to trust the hidden order within your creative chaos, you discover that you are not disorganized. You are organized according to principles more sophisticated than any system devised by purely rational thought. This is the final sign, the ultimate recognition of what it means to be a creative soul in authentic relationship with the sources of inspiration. Your beautiful chaos is cosmos in disguise, the visible manifestation of invisible patterns that operate according to laws more ancient and wise than any human planning could devise. In trusting this chaos, in learning to work with it rather than against it, you become a conscious collaborator in the great work of transformation that Jung called the opus contra naturam, the conscious participation in the unconscious process through which life organizes itself into ever more complex and meaningful forms of beauty and truth. Your chaos contains hidden order because you contain hidden order, because consciousness itself contains hidden order, because the universe itself is a vast creative chaos, eternally organizing itself into new possibilities for meaning and beauty and love. In accepting the 11th sign, in learning to trust the creative chaos that others fear and misunderstand, you become a living demonstration of how apparent disorder can be the most profound form of order, how confusion can be the birthplace of clarity, how the willingness to not know can be the most direct path to the deepest forms of knowing. This is your gift to a world that prizes false order over authentic complexity, superficial organization over meaningful depth. Through your trust in creative chaos, You demonstrate that there are forms of intelligence that operate beyond the reach of rational control, forms of beauty that emerge only when consciousness learns to collaborate with forces it cannot fully understand. Your chaotic creative process is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived, not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be celebrated, not a sign of your limitation, but a testament to your willingness to participate in the unlimited creative potential that moves through all authentic expression. In the beautiful chaos of your creative process, the hidden order of the cosmos reveals itself through your particular hands, your unique vision, your irreplaceable contribution to the great work of consciousness, knowing itself through infinite forms of creative expression. Your chaos is not chaos at all. It is the visible signature of invisible intelligence, the footprint of the eternal creative principle that moves through time and space and human consciousness, forever organizing apparent disorder into new possibilities for meaning, beauty, and love. Now comes the great work of integration, the sacred art of living as a creative soul in a world that often fears and misunderstands the very forces that give your life its deepest meaning. Jung understood that individuation, the journey toward wholeness, is not a retreat from the world, but a deeper engagement with it, a way of inhabiting your authentic nature while maintaining the connections that make human life possible and meaningful. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the creative path, learning to honor your essential nature without sacrificing your capacity for love, relationship, and service to the larger human community. The 11 signs you have recognized within yourself are not separate phenomena but facets of a single diamond, different angles through which the light of your creative nature refracts into the visible spectrum of daily life. Your sensitivity and your calling, your relationship with chaos and your need for solitude, your struggles with time and your experiences of synchronicity. All of these are expressions of a unified way of being that Jung called the transcendent function, the bridge between conscious and unconscious, finite and infinite, personal and archetypal. Yet living this integration in a world organized around different principles requires both wisdom and courage. The society that surrounds you operates largely from what Jung termed the adapted personality, the collective mask that prioritizes efficiency over authenticity, productivity over depth, conformity over individuation. Your creative soul naturally resists this adaptation, not from rebelliousness, but from an instinctive recognition that such adaptation would mean the death of what is most essential in you. This resistance creates what might be called the fundamental tension of the creative life, how to remain true to your nature while meeting your human needs for belonging, security, and meaningful relationship. The answer lies not in choosing one over the other, but in discovering what Jung called the middle way, the path that honors both your individual calling and your social responsibilities, both your need for creative authenticity and your need for human connection. Begin with the recognition that your creativity is not separate from your humanity, but is your particular way of expressing it. The sensitivity that makes you vulnerable to the world's pain is the same sensitivity that allows you to create works of healing beauty. The chaos that others find disturbing is the same chaos from which you birth new forms of order and meaning. The solitude that might seem antisocial is the same solitude in which you commune with the forces that connect all beings. Your creative nature is not a departure from your humanity, but its deepest flowering. This understanding transforms your relationship with the apparent opposition between creative life and ordinary life. Rather than seeing yourself as fundamentally different from others, you begin to recognize that you are simply expressing human potentials that exist in everyone but remain dormant in most. Your role is not to separate yourself from the uncreative world, but to serve as a reminder of what lies sleeping in every human heart: the capacity for wonder, the hunger for beauty, the need for meaning that transcends mere survival. Yet, this service requires great skill in what might be called creative diplomacy, the art of translating between the language of depth and the language of surface, between the rhythms of inspiration and the demands of schedule, between the values of the soul and the requirements of society. You learn to become bilingual, fluent both in the tongue of your creative depths and in the common speech that allows you to function in conventional contexts. This bilingual capacity begins with understanding the fears that your creative nature can trigger in others. When people encounter someone who lives from a different center, who operates according to different laws, who seems to have access to sources of fulfillment they cannot identify, it can evoke both attraction and anxiety. Your freedom to follow inspiration may remind others of the ways they have abandoned their own callings. Your willingness to live with uncertainty may illuminate their own excessive need for control. Your capacity for solitude may highlight their fear of being alone with themselves. Rather than taking these reactions personally, you can learn to see them as opportunities for compassion and gentle teaching. Your way of being becomes a quiet invitation for others to remember their own creative potentials, to question whether the security they have chosen is worth the vitality they have sacrificed, to consider what might be possible if they too learn to trust the intelligence of their deeper nature. This teaching happens not through preaching but through presence, not through explanations but through example. When others witness you living authentically from your creative center, managing uncertainty with grace, finding joy in simple acts of expression, maintaining hope in the face of apparent chaos, they receive wordless instruction in possibilities they may have forgotten existed. Your integrated creative life becomes a form of activism, a quiet revolution that demonstrates alternative ways of organizing human existence around depth rather than superficiality, meaning rather than mere accumulation, being rather than mere having. Yet integration also requires setting boundaries that protect your essential nature from forces that would diminish or corrupt it. You learn to distinguish between adaptation that enhances your capacity to serve and adaptation that compromises your authentic expression. Some compromises strengthen the bridge between your inner and outer worlds. Learning to communicate your vision in language others can understand, developing practical skills that support your creative practice, finding ways to earn resources that sustain your artistic work without depleting your creative energy. Other compromises, however, ask too much, requiring you to deny or suppress fundamental aspects of your nature, forcing you to create in ways that serve external agendas rather than authentic expression, demanding that you sacrifice your connection to the sources that nourish your deepest work. Learning to recognize this distinction is one of the most important skills of the integrated creative life. This discrimination requires what Jung called the development of conscious choice, the ability to respond rather than merely react, to choose your adaptations rather than having them imposed upon you by circumstances or social pressure. You learn to see each situation as an opportunity to practice this conscious choosing, to find ways of being present and helpful that do not require you to abandon your essential nature. Your relationships become laboratories for this practice of conscious integration. In intimate partnerships, you discover how to maintain your need for creative solitude while also being genuinely available for connection and mutual support. This might mean establishing sacred times and spaces that are reserved for your creative practice, while also creating rituals of sharing that allow your partner to witness and participate in your creative process in ways that feel nourishing rather than invasive. You learn to communicate about your creative needs, not as selfish demands, but as information about how you are designed, helping those who love you understand that supporting your authentic nature is not sacrifice but investment in your capacity to bring your gifts more fully into the relationship. When your creative soul is honored and nourished, you have more to offer, not less, more presence, more joy, more capacity for the deep intimacy that comes from being truly known and accepted for who you are. With friends and extended family, integration often means gently educating them about the realities of creative work. You help them understand that your irregular schedule is not laziness but alignment with creative rhythms, that your periods of intense focus are not antisocial behavior but necessary for the work that gives your life meaning, that your financial choices may prioritize creative freedom over conventional security because you have discovered forms of wealth that cannot be measured in purely monetary terms. This education happens through patient explanation, combined with consistent demonstration. Over time, people learn to trust that your different way of organizing life produces valuable results, that your creative work contributes something meaningful to the world, that your unconventional choices stem from wisdom rather than mere eccentricity, that your commitment to authenticity makes you more reliable, not less, in the relationships and responsibilities that truly matter. In professional contexts, integration requires developing what might be called strategic authenticity, finding ways to bring your creative gifts into conventional work environments without compromising either your integrity or your effectiveness. You learn to recognize which aspects of your creative nature can be openly shared and which need to be expressed more subtly, which colleagues and supervisors can appreciate your different perspective, and which require more careful handling. Sometimes this means finding or creating work that explicitly values creative thinking and innovative approaches. Other times it means discovering how to fulfill conventional roles in ways that secretly nourish your creative soul, bringing artistic sensibility to mundane tasks, finding creative solutions to routine problems, using your imagination to see possibilities that others miss. The key is maintaining the connection to your creative source, even when that connection cannot be openly acknowledged. Your relationship with money and security evolves as you learn to integrate creative authenticity with practical wisdom. You discover that the conventional equation of security with accumulation often creates more anxiety than the uncertainty you experience when following your creative calling. Real security, you learn, comes not from controlling external circumstances, but from developing the inner resources that allow you to respond creatively to whatever circumstances arise. This might mean learning to live more simply, finding richness in experiences rather than possessions, discovering forms of wealth that cannot be stolen or lost, the wealth of skill and imagination, the wealth of meaningful relationships, the wealth of connection to sources of inspiration that remain available regardless of external circumstances. You learn that financial resources, while necessary, are tools rather than goals, means rather than ends, supports for creative work rather than substitutes for it. Integration also transforms your relationship with success and recognition. While you continue to hope that your creative work will find its appropriate audience and receive the appreciation it deserves, you learn not to depend on external validation for your sense of worth or purpose. Your primary relationship is with the creative source itself, with the intrinsic satisfaction that comes from authentic expression, with the knowledge that you are fulfilling your unique role in the larger pattern of existence. This detachment from external outcomes, paradoxically, often increases the likelihood of conventional success, because work that emerges from authentic relationship with creative source carries a quality that others can sense even when they cannot articulate what makes it special. When you create from genuine inspiration rather than from ego's desire for recognition, your work naturally resonates with the depths in others, creating the kind of meaningful connection that transcends mere entertainment or decoration. Yet integration requires accepting that not everyone will understand or appreciate your creative expression, and that this lack of understanding does not diminish the value of your work. Jung observed that truly original creative expression often requires generations to be fully appreciated, because it addresses aspects of human experience that collective consciousness has not yet learned to recognize or name. Your role is not to create what the world thinks it wants, but to create what the world actually needs, even when that need remains largely unconscious. This acceptance of being ahead of your time, of serving future understanding as much as present appreciation, becomes part of your spiritual practice as a creative soul. You learn to plant seeds that may not flower in your lifetime, to offer gifts that may not be received by their intended recipients, to serve the evolution of human consciousness rather than seeking immediate reward or recognition. Your daily life reflects this integration of temporal and eternal perspectives. You attend to practical necessities while maintaining awareness of deeper purposes, fulfill immediate responsibilities, while keeping faith with long-term creative visions, engage with present circumstances, while remaining oriented toward the timeless values that guide your deepest work. This creates what might be called a sacred ordinariness in your approach to daily life. Washing dishes becomes a meditation on the transformation of disorder into order. Paying bills becomes a practice of gratitude for the resources that support your creative work. Conversations with neighbors become opportunities to practice presence and compassion. Every aspect of ordinary life becomes infused with the same attention and intentionality that you bring to your explicitly creative activities. The integration extends to your relationship with your own body and physical health. You learn to honor your body as the instrument through which creative expression manifests, developing practices that maintain not just physical health, but the particular kind of vitality that creative work requires. This might mean unusual sleep schedules that honor your natural rhythms, dietary choices that support sustained concentration, exercise routines that help process the intensity of creative engagement. You discover that your body holds wisdom about creative process that your mind alone cannot access. Certain postures facilitate particular kinds of creative thinking. Specific breathing patterns help you access deeper levels of inspiration. Movement practices can unlock solutions to creative problems that rational analysis could not solve. Your integration as a creative soul includes learning to inhabit your body as a creative instrument rather than merely the vehicle for your mind. Your relationship with place and environment becomes another dimension of creative integration. You learn to recognize which physical environments support your creative work and which deplete it, which spaces invite inspiration and which block it, which arrangements of objects and colors and light help you access your deepest creative states. Your living and working spaces become external expressions of your inner creative landscape, carefully arranged to support the delicate process of translating invisible inspiration into visible form. This attention to environment extends beyond your personal spaces to your relationship with the natural world. Many creative souls discover that regular contact with nature, whether through gardening, walking, or simply sitting outdoors, provides essential nourishment for their creative process. Nature operates according to the same principles of organic unfolding that govern authentic creative expression, and conscious relationship with natural cycles can help attune your personal creative rhythms to larger patterns of growth, rest, death, and renewal. The integration of your creative nature with your spiritual development becomes one of the most profound aspects of living as a creative soul. You discover that creativity and spirituality are not separate pursuits, but different aspects of the same fundamental relationship with mystery, meaning, and transcendence. Your creative practice becomes a form of devotion, your artistic expressions become offerings, your studio becomes a space of communion with whatever you understand as sacred. This spiritual dimension of creative integration helps resolve one of the central challenges of the creative life, the tendency toward isolation and self-centeredness that can develop when someone becomes too focused on personal expression. When you understand your creativity as service to something greater than your individual ego, when you recognize your artistic work as contribution to the collective human project of making meaning from existence, your creative practice naturally becomes more generous, more connected, more aligned with values that transcend personal ambition. Jung understood that the ultimate goal of individuation is not the inflation of the personal ego, but its right relationship with the self, that deeper organizing principle that connects individual consciousness with its cosmic context. For the creative soul, this means recognizing that your particular gifts are not possessions but responsibilities, not advantages but opportunities for service, not proof of your specialness, but evidence of your participation in the universal creative principle that seeks expression through all forms of life. This understanding transforms potential ego inflation into genuine humility, potential narcissism into authentic service, potential isolation into deeper connection. Your creative work becomes not self-expression, but self-expression, using your individual consciousness as an instrument for something that transcends personal identity, while simultaneously fulfilling your deepest personal authenticity. The integration of creative soul with ordinary life ultimately reveals that there is no fundamental opposition between these realms, that creativity is not escape from reality, but deeper engagement with it, that artistic expression is not withdrawal from human community, but contribution to its ongoing evolution, that the path of authentic self-expression leads not away from love, but toward more profound forms of loving. This is Jung's vision of individuation realized in the life of the creative soul, not becoming someone other than who you are, but becoming who you most truly are, not separating from the world, but finding your right relationship with it, not choosing between creativity and connection, but discovering how authentic creativity enhances your capacity for meaningful relationship with both yourself and others. Living as a creative soul in an uncreative world is not a burden to bear but a gift to unwrap, not a problem to solve, but a mystery to inhabit, not a conflict to resolve, but a paradox to embrace. Your creative nature is not separate from your humanity, but is your particular way of being human. Your artistic gifts are not decorations added to ordinary life, but expressions of the extraordinary potential that exists within all apparently ordinary existence. In accepting this integration, in learning to live authentically from your creative center, while maintaining loving connection with the larger human community, you become a bridge between worlds, translating the language of depth for those who have forgotten how to speak it, demonstrating possibilities for authentic living that inspire others to remember their own creative potentials, serving as a reminder that there are ways of organizing human life around meaning rather than mere survival, beauty rather than mere functionality, love rather than mere transaction. This is your gift to a world that desperately needs what you have to offer, not your artistic productions alone, but your way of being, your demonstration that it is possible to live authentically in an inauthentic world, creatively in an uncreative culture, spiritually in a materialistic society. Your integrated creative life becomes itself a work of art, a living poem, a continuous creation that demonstrates the possibility of human existence organized around the deepest values of beauty, truth, and love. Your creativity is not separate from your spirituality. It is your spirituality made manifest, your particular way of participating in the ongoing creation of the world, your unique contribution to the great work of consciousness, knowing itself through infinite forms of creative expression. In learning to live as an integrated creative soul, you discover that your apparent strangeness is actually your greatest gift, your supposed impracticality, your most practical offering, your seeming otherworldliness, your most concrete contribution to the transformation of this world into something more beautiful, more meaningful, more aligned with the creative potential that moves through all authentic expression of human consciousness, in conscious collaboration with the mysterious source from which all beauty, meaning, and love continuously emerge. You have traveled far, fellow seeker, through the labyrinthine corridors of your own creative nature. You have recognized the signs that mark you as one chosen to serve forces larger than individual desire. You have learned to read the impossible colors that paint your dreams, to trust the wisdom that emerges in solitude, to honor the sensitivity that makes you both vulnerable and visionary. You have discovered that your difference is not defect but divine assignment, that your seeming strangeness is actually profound alignment with creative principles that govern the universe itself. Now comes the most challenging work of all, learning to live as a fully integrated creative soul in a world that often fears what it cannot understand, that dismisses what it cannot measure, that attempts to normalize what was never meant to fit into conventional categories. This is not about hiding your creative nature to avoid conflict, nor about flaunting it to prove your specialness. This is about something far more sophisticated and ultimately more powerful, learning to embody your authentic creative identity so completely that it becomes a gift to everyone you encounter, whether they recognize it as such or not. Jung's vision of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, offers the roadmap for this final integration. Individuation does not mean becoming someone else. It means becoming more fully who you have always been beneath the layers of conditioning, expectation, and borrowed identity. For the creative soul, individuation and creation are not separate processes, but two faces of the same sacred work. Every authentic creative act is an expression of your individuation. Every step toward greater wholeness enhances your creative capacity. The integration you now undertake requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox without collapsing into either extreme, to honor both your unique creative nature and your shared humanity, to remain true to your calling, while remaining responsive to the legitimate needs of relationship and community. This is perhaps the most delicate balance the creative soul must learn to maintain, how to be authentically yourself without becoming so isolated in your authenticity that you lose connection with the very people your creative work is meant to serve. The world into which you must integrate your creative nature is not inherently hostile to creativity, but it is often unconscious of its own creative foundations. The buildings that house skeptics were designed by architects who dreamed in impossible geometries. The technologies that connect critics were invented by visionaries who saw beyond the limitations of their time. The very language through which creativity is dismissed was created by poets and storytellers who understood that words carry power beyond their literal meaning. Your task is not to convince an uncreative world to become creative, for it is already more creative than it knows, but to serve as reminder, as catalyst, as living example of what becomes possible when creative nature is fully embraced and skillfully expressed. You are here to model integration rather than to preach it, to demonstrate wholeness rather than to argue for it, to embody the truth that creativity and practicality are not opposites, but partners in the dance of conscious evolution. This integration begins with accepting full responsibility for your gifts, not the burden of guilt-ridden obligation, but the mature acceptance that comes with recognizing that your creative capacities are not personal possessions, but temporary stewardships. You have been entrusted with abilities that extend beyond your individual needs and desires. The question is not whether you deserve these gifts. The fact that you have received them creates their own justification, but whether you are prepared to serve as their worthy guardian and effective translator. Responsibility for your creative gifts includes developing the skills necessary to express them effectively. Raw talent without disciplined craft becomes mere self-indulgence. Authentic inspiration without practical competence remains forever trapped in the realm of good intentions. The integration of creative nature requires wedding vision to skill, marrying possibility to technique, uniting the receptive capacity that receives inspiration with the active capacity that gives it concrete form. But skill alone is not sufficient for true integration. You must also develop what might be called relational intelligence, the ability to share your creative gifts in ways that serve others, rather than merely expressing yourself, that build bridges rather than dig trenches, that invite participation rather than demanding admiration. Your creativity must become not just personal fulfillment, but social contribution, not just individual expression, but collective healing. This relational dimension of creative integration requires learning to translate the language of your inner experience into forms that others can receive and understand without betraying the essential truth of your vision. It means developing sensitivity not only to your own creative process, but to the creative needs of those around you, recognizing that everyone carries seeds of creative potential that may be dormant but are never truly dead. The creative soul, living in apparent contradiction with an uncreative world, often faces the temptation to retreat into protective isolation or to rebel through aggressive confrontation, but integration calls for a third way, what Jung called the middle path, that honors both your need for authentic expression and others' need for safety and understanding. This path requires tremendous emotional maturity and spiritual wisdom, for it asks you to remain open-hearted in the face of misunderstanding, generous in the face of criticism, and patient in the face of indifference. Your sensitivity, which once felt like weakness in a world that values toughness, reveals itself through integration as your greatest strength. It is precisely because you feel so deeply that you can create works that touch others' hearts. It is precisely because you perceive so much that you can offer perspectives that expand others' vision. It is precisely because you are moved by beauty, truth, and possibility that your creative work carries the power to move others toward their own greater wholeness. But sensitivity without boundaries becomes overwhelming vulnerability. Integration requires learning to protect your creative nature without armoring it, to maintain openness without losing discernment, to remain responsive without becoming reactive. You must develop what might be called permeable boundaries, membranes that filter out what would poison your creative spirit, while allowing in what nourishes and inspires it. The practice of creative integration involves learning to live in multiple dimensions simultaneously. You inhabit the ordinary world of practical responsibilities, social obligations, and material needs, but you also dwell in the extraordinary world of creative possibility, symbolic meaning, and transpersonal connection. Most people live primarily in one dimension or the other, but the integrated creative soul learns to move fluidly between both, to be equally at home in boardroom and artist studio, in everyday conversation and sacred silence. This multidimensional living requires what Jung called psychological flexibility, the capacity to adapt your expression to different contexts without losing your essential identity, to speak different languages without forgetting your native tongue, to wear different masks without forgetting the face beneath them all. You learn when to reveal your full creative intensity and when to modulate it for the sake of effective communication. You discover how to honor your need for depth without drowning others in depths they are not prepared to navigate. The integration process also involves healing the split between creativity and spirituality that modern culture has artificially imposed. For the integrated creative soul, these are not separate domains, but different aspects of the same fundamental orientation toward life. Your creativity is not separate from your spirituality. It is your spirituality made manifest. Your spiritual practice is not separate from your creative work. It is the foundation from which authentic creative expression flows. This unity of creativity and spirituality transforms both domains. Your creative work becomes a form of prayer, a way of participating in the ongoing creation of reality itself. Your spiritual practice becomes a wellspring of creative inspiration, a source of the vision and energy necessary to translate possibility into actuality. You discover that the same forces that draw you into communion with the sacred also drive you toward authentic creative expression, that the same qualities that make you effective as a creative artist also make you effective as a spiritual being. Living as an integrated creative soul means accepting that your path will never be conventional, that your choices will often be misunderstood, that your priorities will sometimes seem incomprehensible to minds that operate according to different values and assumptions, but it also means discovering that this apparent isolation is actually profound connection with creative forces that transcend individual consciousness, with archetypal patterns that govern all human experience, with the eternal principles that ensure that what is truly necessary will always find a way to manifest through willing vessels. The integration you achieve is not a final destination, but an ongoing process, not a problem solved once and for all, but a dynamic balance that must be continually maintained through conscious attention and skillful action. Like a master sailor who reads wind and wave and adjusts sail and rudder accordingly, you learn to navigate the changing conditions of creative life while maintaining steady progress toward your deepest purposes. Your relationships become laboratories for creative integration as you learn to share your authentic nature without overwhelming those who may not be prepared for full exposure to creative intensity. You discover that many people hunger for the very qualities you embody: depth, authenticity, vision, connection to meaning, even when they seem to reject or fear these qualities. Your task becomes learning to offer these gifts in doses and forms that others can receive, to serve as invitation rather than invasion, to model possibility rather than demand acceptance. The creative soul in integration learns to dance with opposition rather than being defeated by it. When you encounter those who dismiss creativity as frivolous luxury or dangerous self-indulgence, you recognize their words as symptoms of their own creative wounding rather than accurate assessments of creative work's value. Your response becomes compassionate understanding rather than defensive argument, patient demonstration rather than heated persuasion. You begin to see that every person you encounter is engaged in their own process of becoming, their own journey toward greater wholeness and authentic expression. Some are further along this path than others. Some have been wounded by early experiences that taught them to fear their own creative nature. Some have simply never been exposed to models of healthy creative living. Your integrated creative presence becomes a healing influence, offering evidence that it is possible to be both creative and responsible, both visionary and practical, both sensitive and strong. The work environment becomes a particular arena for creative integration as you learn to bring your authentic nature into spaces that may seem hostile to creative expression. But you discover that every workplace, every professional context, every practical endeavor actually requires creative problem-solving, innovative thinking, and visionary planning. Your task becomes recognizing and nurturing the creative elements already present rather than trying to impose foreign creative categories where they don't belong. You learn to speak the language of practical benefit while remaining true to creative values, to demonstrate the effectiveness of creative approaches through results rather than rhetoric. Your creativity becomes not an addition to your professional competence, but the foundation that makes all your other skills more effective, more flexible, more responsive to changing conditions and emerging opportunities. The financial dimension of creative integration requires particular wisdom and patience. The creative soul must learn to generate material security without compromising creative integrity, to meet practical needs without abandoning spiritual values. This often means developing multiple income streams, some of which may be directly creative while others support your creative work indirectly. You learn that there is no shame in doing practical work to support your calling, that survival and service are not contradictory goals but complementary aspects of mature creative living. But you also learn to recognize and trust the mysterious ways that authentic creative work tends to generate its own support when pursued with genuine commitment and skillful action. The universe seems to conspire to support those who serve creative forces larger than personal ambition, though this support may arrive through unexpected channels and according to timelines that challenge conventional expectations. The integrated creative soul develops what might be called economic faith, not naive belief that money will magically appear, but mature trust that creative work aligned with genuine service will eventually find the material support necessary for its continuation and expansion. This faith enables you to make choices based on creative integrity rather than fear-based security, to invest time and energy in projects that may not yield immediate financial return but serve essential creative purposes. Your relationship with time transforms as you learn to honor both the natural rhythms of creative work and the artificial schedules of social and professional obligation. You discover ways to protect the slow, deep time that creative work requires while meeting the fast, shallow demands that practical life imposes. You become skilled at creating pockets of creative space within busy schedules, at maintaining connection with creative sources, even when external circumstances seem to pull you away from them. The integration process involves learning to trust creative timing, the mysterious synchronicities and convergences that seem to orchestrate themselves when you remain true to your creative calling. You begin to notice how projects find you when you are ready for them, how resources appear when they are most needed, how collaborators emerge from unexpected directions when their contributions would be most valuable. This trust in creative timing enables you to remain patient during apparent fallow periods and responsive when moments of creative opportunity present themselves. As integration deepens, you discover that your creative nature is not something you possess, but something that possesses you in the most positive sense, a force that works through you to accomplish purposes that extend far beyond your individual understanding or intention. You become conscious collaborator in processes larger than personal creativity, willing participant in the ongoing evolution of consciousness itself. This recognition brings both profound humility and tremendous empowerment. Humility because you realize that your individual creative achievements are expressions of forces that transcend personal talent or effort. Empowerment because you discover that aligning with these transpersonal creative forces gives your work a potency and effectiveness that purely personal effort could never achieve. The integrated creative soul learns to live in service to what Jung called the self with a capital S, the deeper identity that connects individual consciousness with universal patterns and eternal principles. This self becomes your inner guide, your creative compass, your source of wisdom for navigating the complex challenges that creative living inevitably presents. Learning to distinguish between the voice of this deeper self and the voice of ego-driven ambition becomes one of the most crucial skills for sustained creative integration. Your creative work begins to serve not just personal expression but collective healing, as you recognize that every authentic creative act contributes to the expansion of human consciousness, the enhancement of cultural wisdom, the enrichment of the collective creative treasury, from which future generations will draw inspiration and guidance. You understand that your individual creative journey is simultaneously a contribution to the species-wide journey toward greater creativity, consciousness, and compassion. The apparent contradiction between living as a creative soul in an uncreative world resolves itself through this expanded perspective. You realize that the world is not actually uncreative, but unconsciously creative, not anti-creative, but incompletely creative, not opposed to your creative nature, but unconsciously hungry for the very gifts you have to offer. Your integration becomes a form of service to the world's own creative integration, your individual wholeness, a contribution to collective wholeness. In the end, you discover that being a creative soul is not a burden to bear but a gift to unwrap, not a problem to solve but a mystery to live, not a challenge to overcome but a calling to fulfill. Your creativity reveals itself as the most practical thing about you, the quality that enables you to find solutions where others see only problems, to discover possibilities where others perceive only limitations, to create beauty and meaning in circumstances that might otherwise seem barren or hopeless. The integration of your creative nature transforms not only your relationship with your own gifts, but your understanding of what it means to be fully human. You recognize that creativity is not the special province of artists and innovators, but the birthright of every conscious being, that the same creative intelligence that moves through you is available to everyone who learns to listen for its whisper and trust its guidance. Your life becomes a demonstration that it is possible to honor both creative vision and practical wisdom, to serve both individual authenticity and collective well-being, to live both as unique creative individual and as contributing member of human community. You embody the truth that creativity and responsibility are not opposites but partners, that sensitivity and strength are not contradictions but complementary qualities, that being true to your creative nature is the most generous gift you can offer to a world that hungers for authentic creative expression, even when it seems to fear or reject it. Through your integration, you discover that the greatest creative work is not any particular artistic achievement, but the ongoing masterpiece of a life lived in authentic creative service, a life that honors its gifts without flaunting them, that serves its calling without abandoning its humanity, that remains true to creative vision while staying responsive to the legitimate needs of relationship and community. This is the ultimate creative work, the integration of all that you are into a coherent expression of creative purpose, the weaving of sensitivity and strength, solitude and relationship, vision and skill, into a life that serves as both personal fulfillment and social contribution. In achieving this integration, you become not just a creative person, but a creative presence, someone whose very existence enriches the creative potential of everyone you encounter and contributes to the ongoing creative evolution of consciousness itself. Your creative soul, once perhaps felt as burden or bewildering difference, reveals itself as the very essence of what makes you most valuable to the world, most capable of authentic contribution, most aligned with the fundamental creative principles that drive the universe itself toward ever greater beauty, consciousness, and love. You are not creative despite being human. You are creative because you are most fully human, and in becoming most fully yourself, you serve the creative becoming of all life.